Hi everyone, if you enjoyed this video please subscribe. If you haven't subscribed yet, I'd love to see you join me. And don't forget to like and let me know what you think in the comments. I'm out in the middle of nowhere, Nevada, like way out there. 30 miles outside of Ely, in a little cabin I call home. I'm talking about the kind of place where folks think it's a knee slapper to ask if you've got running water. Name's Jack Stratton, by the way. And before your imagination runs wild, I didn't go off grid to become some kind of mountain man. It ain't like that. See, I was a mechanical engineer for a solid 12 years, living it up in the concrete jungle. Got burned out on the constant noise, the crowds, and just the general messiness of city life. Figured I'd trade in those soul-crushing deadlines for something a bit more peaceful. That is, until things got loud in a way I never saw coming. It was the kind of lazy day where nothing much happens, which out here is pretty much every day. You'd think I'd be bored out of my skull, but honestly, when you're in the high desert, boredom's a luxury you learn to appreciate. My closest neighbors were some ranchers about 10 miles up the road, but I hardly ever saw them. Just the occasional rattlesnake, coyote, or jackrabbit crossing my path. The air was so dry it'd crack your lips, and the wind, that never shut up. But hey, for a guy who wanted nothing to do with people, it was perfect. So, there I was, messing around with this generator I'd rigged up to run off an old car battery, fighting with some stubborn wiring. That's when I started to get this weird feeling, like someone was watching me. It was subtle, you know. Nothing you can put your finger on, just a gut feeling. Except, out here, there wasn't a soul around to be doing the watching. I tried to shake it off, but after an hour or so, I figured a break was in order. Grabbed a beer, went out on the deck, and that's when I saw it. Or rather, what was left of it. There were birds, ravens maybe, circling near a ridge about half a mile out. Now, when you live in the desert, you learn to pay attention to the sky, especially when the birds start acting up. At first, I figured it was probably a dead deer. Maybe something the local predators had gotten to. But these birds, they just kept circling, never landing, and after 20 minutes, my curiosity got the best of me. I grabbed my binoculars, and when I looked through them, the hairs on the back of my neck stood straight up. It wasn't a deer, it was a man. Or at least, what used to be a man. His body was mangled, twisted up in a way that shouldn't even be possible. Half buried in the dirt like he'd been tossed there. It's not the kind of thing you just stumble across, not ever. And to make matters creepier, there wasn't another human being for miles. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to call the cops, but my head was telling me to stay out of it. You ever hear those stories about hikers who vanish, only to be found weeks later, all torn up, with no explanation? Yeah, that's what I was staring at. I hopped in my beat, up old pickup, and drove out there faster than I should have, considering the rough terrain. Dust was kicking up behind me as I got closer to the ridge, and the smell. Oh man, the smell. It hit me like a wall when I finally got out of the truck. Rotting flesh mixed with something else, something sharp and metallic, like sulfur. Look, I've seen death before. Wild animals, even a few unlucky souls during my city days. But this was different. This guy wasn't just dead, he was ravaged. His face was frozen in a silent scream, his jaw hanging slack like he'd been caught mid-yell. His limbs were twisted, broken, with these huge gashes torn into his torso. And that smell. I could barely breathe. There were claw marks. Deep ones, like something huge had gotten a hold of him. I'm no crime scene investigator, but those wounds, they didn't look like anything a bear or a mountain lion could do. Whatever killed this guy, it had taken its sweet time. I reached for my phone, but no signal. Of course not. I had a satellite phone back at the cabin. But there was no way I was leaving this scene without a closer look. I started poking around, hoping maybe I'd find a wallet or some kind of clue as to who this poor guy was. That's when I heard it. A rustling in the brush behind me. I turned around, and for a split second, I thought I was hallucinating. The thing that stepped out of the brush wasn't anything I'd ever seen before. At first, it almost looked like a big wolf, but then it stood up on its hind legs, and I realized just how wrong I was. This thing was nearly 7 feet tall, covered in coarse, dark fur. Its limbs were too long, stretched out in a way that just looked wrong, and its hands, yeah, hands, not paws, had these long, curling claws. Its head was kind of wolf-like, but the snout was too narrow, too sharp, and the teeth, well, let's just say they didn't belong in any normal animal's mouth. I froze. You hear that saying about fight or flight? Let me tell you, when you're staring at something like that, neither of those options seems like it's gonna work out too well. It tilted its head, almost like it was curious, and then it snarled, this low, guttural growl that sent chills down my spine. I don't carry a gun. Never liked M. Never needed one out here. Until now. My hands were shaking as I reached for anything I could use as a weapon. All I had was a wrench from the truck, and that wasn't going to do much against this thing. And it moved fast, way too fast. 1 second it was standing there, and the next it was on me. I barely had time to swing the wrench before its claws ripped through my arm. Pain shot through me like a lightning bolt, and I stumbled back, trying to stay on my feet. Somehow, I managed to scramble back to the truck, but that creature was right behind me. I could hear its breath, hot and ragged, as it closed the distance. My heart was pounding. My vision was blurring, but I wasn't about to die out here, not without a fight. I swung the wrench again, this time catching it on the side of its head. It let out a high-pitched screech and recoiled for just a second, but that was enough. I dove into the driver's seat and slammed the door shut. I fumbled for the keys, my hands slick with sweat and blood. As that thing slammed against the side of the truck, claws screeching against the metal. The engine roared to life, and I floored it, kicking up gravel as I sped back towards the cabin. My arm was throbbing, blood soaking through my shirt, but I couldn't stop. I had no idea if that thing was following me, but I sure as hell wasn't going to slow down to find out. When I finally made it back to the cabin, I jumped out, rushed inside, and slammed the door. My heart was still racing, but I was safe, for now. I grabbed the satellite phone and dialed the sheriff's office. The line crackled to life, and I stammered out what had happened. The whole crazy story. The deputy on the other end sounded skeptical, like I was some nut job rambling about monsters. But he promised to send someone out. They wouldn't be here until morning though, so I was on my own for the night. I barricaded the door with anything I could find, furniture, tools, anything that might slow that creature down. My arm was still bleeding, and I knew I needed to patch it up, but I couldn't stop glancing at the windows, half expecting to see those long, twisted limbs creeping towards the cabin. Hours crawled by, each one longer than the last. The air was thick with tension, every creak of the cabin sending a jolt of fear through me. But nothing came. When the sun finally rose, I was exhausted, barely able to keep my eyes open. Then I heard the sheriff's truck pulling up outside. I stumbled to the door and tore down my makeshift barricade. The deputy gave me this look, somewhere between disbelief and pity, when I told him about the creature. But when he saw the body out near the ridge, his face went pale. They called in more deputies, even a couple of state troopers, and for a while, it was like a scene out of some crime show. Guys in uniforms combing the area, taking pictures, marking off the scene. But they never found that thing. And the sheriff, he just told me to get some rest and not to leave town. Later that day, one of the deputies came by the cabin. He sat down with me, asked a few more questions. He didn't seem to think I was crazy, but he didn't exactly believe me either. Could have been a wild dog, he said. Maybe a bear. I didn't argue, but we both knew that whatever did that to that poor guy wasn't something you'd find in any textbook. A few days later, they sent a crew out to clean up the mess. The body was taken away, and I never heard another word about it. No news reports, no updates from the sheriff, nothing. It was like it never even happened. Except it did. So, life was supposed to go back to normal. After that, whatever normal is when you've seen something that defies all logic and reason. But let me tell you, things were different. I was different. For a while, every creak of the cabin, every rustle in the bushes outside, had me jumping out of my skin. Sleep. Forget about it. I'd doze off for maybe an hour or two, only to be jolted awake by nightmares, seeing those glowing eyes, those razor-sharp claws. I kept replaying the whole thing in my head, trying to make sense of it. Was I going crazy? Had the isolation finally gotten to me? But then I'd look at the scars on my arm, still healing. Still a stark reminder that it wasn't some hallucination. That thing was real. And it was still out there, somewhere in the vast emptiness of the desert. The locals, they had their theories, of course. Whispers in the general store in Ely, hushed conversations at the gas station. Some said it was a skinwalker, a shapeshifter from Navajo legend. Others talked about a government experiment gone wrong, some kind of mutated animal that had escaped from a secret lab. Crazy stuff, right? But out here, where the line between reality and myth gets a little blurry, you start to wonder. I tried to go back to my routine, fixing things, tending to my little patch of land, but the peace I'd found out here was gone. I was always looking over my shoulder, always listening for any sound out of the ordinary. I even started carrying a rifle, something I'd always sworn against. It felt strange, heavy in my hands, but it was a small comfort, a thin layer of protection against the unknown. Weeks turned into months, and the initial shock started to wear off, replaced by a kind of dull, lingering fear. I never saw the creature again, but I knew, deep down, that it was still out there. And I knew that what happened to that poor guy, it could happen to me too. I thought about leaving, packing up and heading back to the city, back to the noise and the crowds. But something kept me rooted here. Maybe it was stubbornness. Maybe it was a refusal to be driven out by fear. Or maybe it was something else, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. One day, I was driving back from Ely after picking up some supplies. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the desert, turning the landscape into a sea of reds and oranges. It was beautiful, in a haunting sort of way. And that's when I saw it, a figure in the distance, silhouetted against the dying light. It was too far away to make out any details, but I knew, instinctively, what it was. My heart started pounding, my hands tightening on the steering wheel. I wanted to floor it, to get back to the cabin as fast as possible, but I couldn't. I was frozen, just like that night on the ridge. The figure stood there for a long moment, just watching me, and then it turned and vanished into the darkness. I don't know why it didn't come after me. Maybe it was just curious. Maybe it was toying with me. Or maybe, just maybe, it was a reminder. A reminder that I was living in its territory now, that I was a guest in a world I didn't fully understand. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I sat by the window, rifle in my lap, staring out into the darkness. And as the sun began to rise, I knew one thing for sure. My life out here would never be the same. I'd found the solitude I'd been searching for, but it came at a price. A price I was still paying, every single day. The peace was gone, replaced by a constant awareness, a knowledge that I was sharing this land with something else, something ancient and powerful, something that was always watching, always waiting, and all I could do was wait too. Wait and wonder when, or if, it would ever show itself again. I knew in my heart if it did, I probably would not survive a second encounter. I was living on borrowed time in a place where I didn't belong, and I had no one to blame but myself. My food was running dangerously low, and that's the kind of thing that'll drag a guy back to civilization faster than any boogeyman story. Not that I was scared, initially anyway. It's 1998, and I've been living off the grid in northern Montana for a full year. My name's Jack Reed, and yeah, I probably sound like one of those hardcore survivalist types, but trust me, I'm not. I just got fed up with all the noise and the drama of people. Figured it'd be quieter out here, and it was, until it wasn't. I built a cabin out of scrap wood, fished in the streams, and even learned how to can my own food. There's something ironic about it, you know. The moment you stop giving a damn about people is the exact moment they start showing up at your doorstep. A few weeks ago, a couple of hikers stumbled across my cabin. They were lost, but they had all this fancy gear: GPS, water purifiers, even a satellite phone. Lost, my ass, more like nosy. They were curious about the recluse living up in the mountains. I gave them some of my fish, we chatted for a bit, and I sent them on their way. Big mistake, as it turns out. About a week later, a ranger comes up, asking if I'd seen those two. Apparently, they never made it back to their car. I hadn't seen or heard anything since they left my place, so I told the ranger the truth. She thanked me and left, but I could tell she was shaken up. I mean, people get lost all the time in these mountains, but not with gear like that. These weren't amateurs. Now, I've always been a practical guy. I don't believe in ghosts, aliens, or any of that hocus pocus. But when I woke up one night to a weird noise outside the cabin, something that sounded like a coyote crossed with a squealing pig, I grabbed my rifle. I figured it was some wounded animal, maybe a mountain lion, and I went out to check it out. What I found, I still don't have a good explanation for it. The night was so quiet you could hear a pin drop. Even the wind seemed to be holding its breath. There's a lot of wildlife out here, but everything was still. Too still. It didn't take long before I saw something moving between the trees. It was big, hunched over, but moving fast. At first, I thought it was a bear, but bears don't move like that. They don't slink, for one thing. This thing had fur, but it wasn't the kind you'd expect. It was patchy, like it had been rubbed off in places, and the parts that still had fur were matted and wet. I couldn't see its face clearly, but I could see how it moved, low to the ground, like it was ready to pounce. Here's the kicker: when I shined my flashlight on it, it didn't run away like most animals would. It just stopped, turned toward me and started walking, slowly. I raised my rifle, but there's something unsettling about pointing a gun at something that isn't afraid of it. My hands were steady, but my mind was racing. I didn't know what I was looking at. I'm not proud of what happened next, but I ran. I sprinted back into the cabin, slammed the door, and bolted it shut. For the next hour I sat there, rifle trained on the door, waiting. I didn't sleep that night. Hell, I barely breathed. But the thing didn't come any closer. Or at least, I didn't hear it if it did. The next morning, I decided I'd head into town. I needed supplies anyway, and if those hikers were still missing, maybe I could help track them down. Plus, I needed a break. The woods were starting to get to me. As I hiked toward my truck, I found something in the dirt that made me stop dead in my tracks. A boot print. Not mine, not the ranger's, not recent either. It was partially buried, but it was there, clear as day. Whoever left it hadn't been in a rush. They'd been standing there, watching. The print was deep, which meant they'd stood there for a while. By the time I got to the truck, I was seriously thinking about just packing up and leaving for good. The thought of being out here alone, with that thing roaming around. Yeah, I'm not ashamed to admit it rattled me. But I'm stubborn, so I headed into town for supplies, figuring maybe a day or two away would clear my head. Town wasn't much better. I picked up my groceries, checked in with the ranger station, and heard the same thing, no sign of the hikers. The ranger, a different one this time, asked if I'd be willing to help with the search. Now, I'm not heartless, but I also didn't want to go trekking back into those woods just to find 2 dead bodies. So, I politely declined. I got back to the cabin just before dark, and that's when things went from bad to worse. There was something off about the cabin when I got back. The door was slightly open, even though I knew I'd locked it. Inside, everything looked fine at first glance, but then I noticed the food. The bags I'd packed were torn open. The contents spilled all over the floor. Some of it had been eaten, but not in a way that made sense. It wasn't like a person had come through and rummaged. It was like something had gnawed through it. My rifle, still hanging by the door, was untouched. That's when I heard it again. The same sound from the night before. This time it was closer, coming from just outside the cabin. It was like a low screech, followed by a series of clicking noises, like claws tapping on wood. And then came the smell. Rot. Something was rotting nearby, and it was close enough that I could taste it in the air. I grabbed the rifle, not caring anymore if the thing was scared of it or not, and slowly opened the door. Nothing. Just the trees swaying slightly in the wind. But I knew it was there. I could feel it. That's when I heard a noise behind me, inside the cabin. spinning around. I saw it standing in the doorway, half hidden in the shadows. Its shape was vaguely human, but there was nothing human about the way it stood. Hunched over, limbs too long for its body, one arm dragging on the floor, like it didn't know how to use it properly. The fur I'd seen before was even patchier up close, and its skin underneath was grey and cracked, like something that had been dead for a long time but didn't know it yet. I didn't think, I shot. The bullet hit it square in the chest, but it barely flinched. Instead, it lurched forward, its head twitching unnaturally, like it was trying to understand what had just happened. Panic set in. I fired again, this time aiming for its leg. That seemed to work, and it staggered, collapsing onto the floor with a wet thud. But the sound it made when it hit the ground wasn't right. It was like a bag of bones hitting the dirt, not a solid body. I stood over it, breathing hard, waiting for it to move again. It didn't. Slowly, I approached, keeping the rifle trained on it. Its chest wasn't moving, no breathing, dead. I waited for another hour, gun in hand, watching it, expecting it to get up again. When it didn't, I finally moved closer. There was no blood, but the thing was definitely dead. Or whatever you'd call something like that. Its skin was cold and stiff, like it had been dead for days. And yet, there it was, still warm to the touch when I first shot it. Now, I'm not an idiot. I wasn't going to stay in the cabin with a dead thing on the floor. So, I grabbed my bag, packed up what I could, and left. But before I did, I noticed something sticking out of its mouth, a strip of fabric. The same kind those hikers had been wearing. I left it there. Let the rangers deal with it. They'd find the hikers, or what was left of them, soon enough. I just wasn't sticking around to find out how much was left. As for the thing, well, it's still in my cabin. Or at least, it was when I left. I drove straight through the night, not stopping until I was well clear of those mountains. I don't know what it was, and honestly, I don't want to know. Some things are better left unexplained. Maybe it was some kind of genetic freak, a mutation, or maybe it was something else entirely, something unnatural. All I know is, I'm not going back there, not ever. I'll find somewhere else to disappear, somewhere far away from the deep woods and the things that live in them. I'll get a regular job, maybe even try to blend in with normal folks for a while. It'll be a change, that's for sure. But after what I saw, what I experienced, I think I'm ready for a little bit of normal, a little bit of noise. I left my old life behind in that cabin, along with that creature, whatever it was. Maybe the rangers will find it. Maybe they'll figure out what happened to those hikers. Or maybe it'll just become another unsolved mystery, another story whispered around campfires in the Montana wilderness. A cautionary tale about the things that go bump in the night, and the dangers of straying too far from the well-worn path. As for me, I'll be somewhere else, trying to forget the way it looked at me, the way it moved, the way it smelled. Trying to forget the chilling sound of its screech echoing through the silent woods. But I know I won't. You don't just forget something like that. It stays with you, buried deep down inside, a dark secret you carry with you, always. A constant reminder that the world is a much stranger, much more terrifying place than most people could ever imagine. And sometimes, the quietest places hold the deadliest secrets. The kind of secrets that can change a man forever. My name's Alex, and I'm about to tell you how I ended up trading my 9 to 5 for a one-way ticket to Crazy Town. It all started back in '98. I was 32, living in the city, and completely burnt out. Picture this: the whole shebang, traffic, deadlines, and that soul-crushing feeling of being just another cog in the machine. You know, the usual grind. I was drowning in a sea of noise, both literally and figuratively. Every day felt the same, and I was itching for something different. People always talk about dropping everything and moving to the middle of nowhere. Escape the rat race, they say. Find yourself. Well, I did more than just talk. I actually did it. Sold my stuff, packed a bag, and bought a piece of land outside this tiny little speck on the map called Stanley, Idaho. Building my escape. This wasn't some pre-fab cabin. Mind you, I built this place from the ground up with my own 2 hands. No power lines, no phone service, no nosy neighbors. Just me, the mountains, and a whole lot of trees. It was exactly the kind of escape I craved. My only company was a stack of old paperback novels I'd picked up at a garage sale. At first, it felt like a dream. Fresh air, stunning views, and the kind of quiet that makes you realize how loud the city really is. I was living the simple life, chopping my own wood, getting water from a nearby stream, and setting traps for small game. It was the ultimate off the grid experience. Like I said, a dream. Or so I thought. The reality of roughing it. Let me tell you, living off the grid isn't exactly like the movies. It's not all picturesque sunsets and singing birds. Half the time, you're just trying not to freeze your butt off or starve to death. I had this little joke I'd tell myself every time I was out chopping wood. 2 things you don't mess with: an axe and a man who's had to poop in the woods during a snowstorm. It was rough, it was raw, but it was simple. And for a while, I was okay with that. The first signs of trouble now: I never considered myself a gun guy. Never trusted myself around them, to be honest. And out there, I figured, what was I going to need a gun for? It wasn't like the squirrels were planning an armed uprising. But boy, was I wrong. I should have had a backup plan, some way to defend myself. That was a mistake, a big one. It started with my traps. I'd set them out to catch rabbits, mostly just to mix things up a bit. One morning I go out, and every single trap is sprung. Empty. Not a single rabbit. Not a scrap of fur. Not a footprint, nothing. Like they just vanished into thin air. Well, there goes breakfast, I muttered, figuring it was just some weird fluke. But then it happened again, and again. 3 mornings in a row. All my traps were empty. That's when I started getting this uneasy feeling, like someone was messing with me. Someone or something. I looked for footprints, but couldn't find any. It didn't make sense. Who would hike all the way out here just to steal my rabbits? Stanley wasn't exactly a booming metropolis. The nearest town was miles away, and the folks who lived there weren't exactly the type to go traipsing through the woods for kicks. The thought did cross my mind that maybe it was some kind of animal. But what kind of animal could work those traps so cleanly, without leaving a trace? And why take the whole animal? Most predators would have just eaten their fill right there. A glimpse of horror. A few days later, I found something that sent a chill down my spine. About a quarter mile from my cabin, I stumbled across what was left of a deer, or at least I think it was a deer. Its body was mangled, torn apart in ways that just didn't seem natural. The head was twisted all the way around, like someone had just snapped it like a twig, and the legs, they were gone. Ripped clean off. No bite marks, no claw marks, just gone. I'm not easily spooked, but that did it for me. I turned around and started heading back to the cabin, walking a lot faster than I usually do. The woods were dead silent. No birds, no wind. Just the sound of my boots on the dead leaves. I kept telling myself it was just a freak occurrence. Some weird animal attack. I'd get back to the cabin, lock the door, and everything would be back to normal by morning. But it wasn't. It was far from normal. The night visitor, that night, something tapped on my window. At first, I thought it was just a tree branch. But then it happened again. Tap, tap, tap. It was too deliberate, too rhythmic to be random. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me not to look. But you know how it is, curiosity killed the cat, and all that. So, against my better judgment, I crept over to the window, holding my breath like a kid trying to sneak a cookie. And that's when I saw it. It was like nothing I'd ever seen before. The closest thing I could compare it to was a wolf, but a wolf that stood on two legs like a man and had arms that were way too long. It was covered in this coarse, bristly fur, and its hands, they ended in these long, sharp claws. But the face, that's what really got me. It was twisted, almost like it was trying to mimic a human face, but failing miserably. And it was grinning. I swear to God, it was grinning at me through the window. My mind went blank. I stumbled backward, knocking over a chair. My legs wouldn't work. I tripped and hit the floor hard, and that's when the thing's grin got wider. It started tapping again, slower this time. Tap, tap. I scrambled up, grabbed the poker from beside the fireplace, and backed myself into a corner. It didn't try to break the window. It didn't try to force its way in. It just stood there, watching me. Like it was playing with me. I stayed in that corner all night, clutching that poker like it was some kind of magic wand that could protect me from whatever that thing was. By morning, it was gone. I didn't leave the cabin for 3 days. Not because I didn't want to, but because I couldn't. Every time I even thought about going outside, I'd see that thing standing there, grinning at me like it knew something I didn't. It was like being trapped in a bad dream, only I couldn't wake up. Weirdly enough, my traps remained untouched after that night, and the whole area around my cabin went completely silent. No deer, no rabbits, not even the birds were singing. It was like the entire forest knew something bad had moved in, something it was afraid of. Eventually, though, hunger won out. I had to get food. I still didn't have a gun, but I grabbed the sharpest hatchet I owned and headed out. Every step feeling like it might be my last. Hunted, the woods were unnervingly quiet, but I could feel it. Something was out there, moving just beyond my sight. It was keeping pace with me, circling. I was being hunted. I was maybe half a mile from the cabin when I saw it again. This time, it wasn't hiding in the shadows. It was standing right in the middle of the trail, hunched over, its face twisted into that same sickening grin. It moved like something broken, jerky and unnatural. But it was fast, so fast. I didn't even have time to react before it was on me. It swiped at me with those long arms. And I ducked just in time, feeling the wind from its claws pass over my head. My hatchet was out of my hand before I even realized I'd dropped it. The chase I ran. I don't think I've ever run that fast in my life. But it was right behind me. I could hear its ragged breathing, smell its rancid, rotting stench. It was like being chased by death itself. I made it back to the cabin and slammed the door shut just as it lunged for me, its claws scraping against the wood. There was no time to think. I bolted the door and ran to the back, looking for something, anything, that could protect me. That's when I heard the door crack. It was trying to get in. Fight or flight, the next few moments are a blur. I don't know if it was survival instinct or just plain desperation, but I grabbed the biggest log from the fireplace and jammed it against the door, bracing it as best I could. For a moment, there was silence. I thought maybe, just maybe, it had given up. Then, with a crash, it smashed through the window. It was inside. It loomed over me, that grin wider now, like it knew this was the end. And I thought, so this is it. This is how I die. Out here, alone. And no one will ever even find me. The thing raised its claws, and I closed my eyes, bracing for the worst. A shot in the dark then. A gunshot rang out. My eyes flew open. The thing staggered backward, a fresh hole blown clean through its chest. I turned around, half expecting to see a park ranger or some hunter standing in the doorway, a smoking gun in hand. But there was no one. Just me and the thing, which had collapsed on the floor, twitching and gasping. I want to be clear about this. It didn't disappear. It didn't vanish into thin air like some cheesy horror movie monster. That thing lay there, bleeding out on my cabin floor. It was real. Gone. I don't know who fired that shot. I don't know if I was hallucinating from fear, or if someone, or something, out there actually saved my life. All I know is, I wasn't alone in those woods that night. I left Stanley the next morning, packed up what little I could carry and hiked out. Didn't tell anyone what happened. Who would believe me anyway? They'd say I was crazy, that I'd imagined the whole thing. But I know what I saw. I know what I felt. And I know I'll never forget that grin, that feeling of being hunted, and the sound of that gunshot that saved my life. Sometimes, when the wind is just right and the trees are rustling in a certain way, I can almost hear it again. That tap, tap, tapping on the window. And I remember that there are things out there in the darkness, things we can't explain, things we don't understand. And sometimes, the only thing standing between us and them is a single, solitary gunshot in the dark. And I'm left wondering if the person who fired that shot even knows that they saved a life. Or if it was even a person at all. It was back in 98, and let me tell you, I was about as far removed from my old life as a guy could get. Deep in the heart of central Montana, swallowed up by those rugged forests. People always talk about needing a break, needing to get away from it all, right? But most of them, they never actually do it. They're all talk, me. I guess I was the one who actually followed through. Name's Finnegan, Finn Riley, by the way. And I was living off the grid before it was cool. Before it was even a hashtag, if you know what I mean. See, I'd spent years stuck in some office, staring at the clock, counting down the minutes until I could escape. Fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, the air thick with the smell of stale coffee and desperation. One day, I just snapped, said screw this, and walked away. Bought a chunk of land outside of Lincoln, Montana, a speck on the map, really. Built myself a little cabin. Life became real simple hunt. Fish, read the same beat-up paperbacks over and over, and breathe the air that didn't smell like car exhaust and broken dreams.
now.
I wasn't some crazy hermit, okay? I wasn't unfriendly or anything. Just a guy who liked his peace and quiet. But even peace and quiet can get old after a while. So, about once a month, I'd drive into town for supplies. Maybe grab a beer with the locals at the Timber Hitch, the only bar worth mentioning in Lincoln. My buddy, alias Ely Thorne, a retired park ranger, would sometimes swing by the cabin, especially if he'd had a few too many. Ely always had some wild stories, full of colorful language. But we never really talked about the weird stuff out in the woods. That was just understood. You didn't need to talk about it. You felt it. This particular year, though, things felt off. It's hard to put into words, but when you spend enough time out here, you get attuned to the land. You notice when things aren't right. The animals, for one. They weren't acting like they usually did. Deer that used to wander right up near my place just stopped showing up. And the birds, it was like someone hit the mute button on the whole forest. Ever been in a forest that's dead silent? It's creepy as hell, eerie. One night, I was out near the edge of my property, maybe a mile from the cabin, setting some rabbit snares. It was getting dark, and my lantern was flickering in the wind, making these weird, dancing shadows on the trees. I thought I heard something, a crunch, like twigs snapping, but way heavier than a fox or something small. I figured it was probably just a bear, so I started heading back to the cabin. And that's when I saw it. Now, I've seen bears. Hell, I've chased them out of my trash more times than I can count. But this thing, this wasn't a bear. It was standing on two legs, like a person, but it was huge, at least 8 feet tall, maybe even bigger. And its arms, Jesus, its arms were long, hanging down almost to its knees. And they ended in these things I can only describe as claws. The whole thing was covered in this thick, matted fur, but its face wasn't like anything I'd ever seen. Almost like a dog's, but wrong, too long stretched out. My gut told me to run, but I couldn't. Not because I was scared stiff, no. I've always been pretty level-headed, even in a tight spot. This thing, it just stared at me. It was like it was sizing me up, trying to decide if I was worth the trouble. And then it let out this sound, not a howl, not a growl, just this low, humming noise that seemed to vibrate right through my bones. I felt it in my teeth. I didn't stick around to find out what it wanted. I took off, sprinting through the trees towards my cabin. The underbrush was like claws, tearing at my legs. You'd think after years out here, I'd know these woods like the back of my hand. But in the dark, everything looked different. I tripped more than once, stumbling over roots and rocks. And I could hear it behind me, moving fast. Too fast for something that big. When I finally burst into the clearing, I could feel it right on my tail. I didn't even look back. Just slammed the cabin door shut, threw the bolt across, and grabbed the old shotgun I kept by the fireplace. My heart was hammering in my chest like a drum, but I tried to steady my breathing. I wasn't going down without a fight. That thing wasn't going to get me. Not here. Not in my own damn cabin. The walls weren't thick, but they were solid wood. I stood in the middle of the room, back to the fireplace, gun aimed at the door. The only sound was my own ragged breath. Then came the scratching. Slow at first, like it was testing the wood. Then it got more insistent. It was trying to get in. I didn't say a word. I don't even know if I could have. My mind was racing. going through every worst-case scenario. Should I make a run for the truck? It was parked about 30 yards from the cabin, but with that thing out there, no way I'd make it. The scratching stopped, and for a second, a stupid, brief second, I thought maybe had given up. Maybe it was gone. I let out a breath, a little too loud, and the next thing I knew, the front window shattered. Glass exploded inwards. It reached inside with that long, messed up arm. Fingers like talons scraping against the wood, trying to find me. I fired the shotgun, more out of instinct than anything else. The blast tore through its arm, and it let out this awful shriek, like a dog's yelp mixed with something metallic. It pulled back, leaving dark, thick blood smeared all over the window frame. For a split second, I thought I'd killed it. But then I heard it again, circling the cabin, low grunts and those heavy footsteps. It was pissed now. I braced myself, reloading the shotgun, my hands shaking. I wasn't armed enough for this. Hell, nobody would be. That thing was unnatural. It wasn't just some freak of nature, or some mutant bear like people talked about sometimes. This was something else. Something that didn't belong here. Something evil. It slammed into the side of the cabin, hard enough to make the whole place creak. I could feel the vibrations under my feet. I fired another shot, this time through the wall, just hoping to scare the damn thing off. Then, silence. Minutes crawled by, but they felt like hours. I didn't hear anything. No movement, no scraping. Just the crackling of the fire dying behind me. I stayed put, gripping the shotgun, listening, waiting for whatever was going to happen next. And then, from outside, there was a thud, followed by a low groan. And then, nothing. The next morning, I found what was left of the thing just outside the cabin, half hidden in the bushes. It was lying there, lifeless. That massive body twisted at an unnatural angle, dark blood pooling underneath it. I didn't get too close. Its face was still contorted, a grotesque snarl frozen in death. It looked part wolf, part man, part something else entirely. Something I couldn't even begin to understand. A few hours later, Ellie showed up. I'd called him that morning, told him I'd shot something strange. When he saw the body, he didn't say much. Just stared at it for a long, long time, his face pale. "You weren't making this up, were you, Finn?" he muttered, more to himself than to me. "We didn't call the cops. We both knew what they'd say. Crazy hermit living out in the woods. Probably shot a bear and panicked. That's what they'd call it. And Ely, well, he had his own reasons for keeping quiet. I think he'd seen things out here before, things he didn't like to talk about. Things he couldn't explain. But if he had, he sure as hell wasn't about to open up about it now. We buried it, out in the woods, far from the cabin. Covered it up with dirt and stones. Better to keep this out of sight," Ailey had said, his voice low. I wasn't about to argue. To this day, I've never spoken about it to anyone else. People wouldn't believe me, anyway. They'd laugh it off, call it a tall tale. But Ely and I, we know what's out there. I still live in that cabin, though I'm a hell of a lot more cautious now. Haven't seen anything like that creature since, and I don't plan on going looking for it, either. But sometimes, when the wind is just right, I swear I can hear that low hum. It doesn't scare me anymore, not like it used to. It just reminds me that this world is a lot stranger than most people will ever know. A lot more dangerous too. Sometimes, late at night. When the fire's dying down and the shadows start to creep in, I find myself thinking about what Ely said, about keeping it out of sight. And I wonder if we did the right thing. Maybe we should have told someone. Maybe there's someone out there who would have understood, who could have explained what that thing was. But then again, maybe some things are better left buried. Some secrets are too heavy to carry, too dangerous to share. Ellie never did tell me what he knew about those woods, about the things that moved in the darkness. But I saw it in his eyes, that day we buried the creature. A kind of haunted look, like he'd seen too much, lived through things he wished he could forget. We never talked about again, not directly, but every now and then, when we'd be sitting on the porch, sharing a beer, he'd say something cryptic, that made me think he knew more than he was letting on. He'd talk about old Native American legends, stories passed down through generations, about creatures that walk between worlds. He never said it outright, but I think he believed those stories. I think he'd seen proof. And sometimes, when I look out at those woods, at the deep shadows and the silent trees, I think maybe he was right. Maybe there are things out there that we can't explain, things that defy logic and reason, things that are best left undisturbed. I guess some mysteries are meant to stay mysteries, some doors are meant to stay closed, and some things are just better left buried deep in the woods, where they belong, and the memory of them left to fade, like footprints in the snow. And out here, in the silence of the Montana wilderness, I keep my secrets close. I keep my shotgun loaded, and I listen to the wind, always listening for that low, unsettling hum, because I know deep down that it's still out there, somewhere, waiting. The only bar in town is still the Timber Hitch. I still see Ely from time to time, but we don't talk about that night. We don't talk about what we buried in the woods, but we both know it's always there, just beneath the surface, waiting, like a bad dream you can't quite shake. That's the thing about the wilderness, it keeps its secrets, and sometimes it shares them with you, whether you want it to or not. My name's Mike Johnson, and let me tell you, I thought I'd seen it all. 2 messy divorces, a construction business that went belly up, and enough speeding tickets to wallpaper my bathroom. I figured the only way to live was off the grid, way out in the sticks of northern Montana, somewhere between civilization and nowhere. You know, the kind of place where nobody could find me. Nobody to nag me, nobody to judge me, and definitely no one to tell me how bad I was at picking wives. My little slice of heaven was a cabin about a 2-hour drive from Kalispell, but good luck finding it if you didn't know where to look. A dirt trail, barely more than a goat path, wound its way up into the mountains. I built the cabin myself. Sure, it was rough around the edges, nothing fancy, just wood nails and a whole lot of sweat. But it was mine, and more importantly, it was quiet. That's all I cared about. I'd been there 3 years without a hitch, except for the occasional raccoon rummaging through my trash. That morning, it had to be around 6 a.m., I heard something outside. I'm not one for sleeping in, thanks to years of early morning construction jobs. But this was different. It wasn't the usual sounds of branches swaying or critters scurrying. Nope. This was more like a thud, like someone had dropped a bag of concrete on my porch. I grabbed my boots, threw on my jacket, and stepped outside. The morning air hit me like a slap in the face, crisp and cold. The first thing I noticed was the silence. No birds chirping, no leaves rustling, just dead quiet. Not even the wind was making a sound. It was unnatural. "Come on, Mike," I muttered to myself. Probably just a deer or something. But as I walked toward where the sound came from, my mind started playing tricks on me. You hear stories up here, local legends about strange things in these woods, but I always figured they were just that. Stories. Then I saw the prints. They were huge, easily the size of my head, and like nothing I'd ever seen before. The claws had dug deep into the soil, leaving marks that couldn't have come from a bear. Too long, too sharp. I crouched down, studying them, my breath fogging up in the cold air. I could smell something, too, something foul, like rotting meat mixed with wet fur. I backed up slowly, my instinct screaming at me. Whatever made those prints wasn't anything I wanted to meet, not out here alone. Of course, I'd left my rifle inside. Great move, Mike. But the knife strapped to my leg would have to do. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. I followed the prints. They led away from my cabin, heading toward the thicker part of the woods, where the trees grew close together. Their branches tangled up like old friends holding hands. The deeper I went, the darker it got, even though the sun was coming up. My gut was telling me to turn back, but curiosity has always been my weakness. I kept going. About 100 yards in, I saw something hanging from a tree. At first, I thought it was just some twisted branches, but as I got closer, I realized it was way worse. It was a deer, or what was left of it, ripped open, its guts hanging out like some kind of sick decoration. The stench hit me hard, and I had to cover my mouth to keep from gagging. The body looked like it had been torn apart, but not by wolves or mountain lions. No, this was different, savage, deliberate. And then I heard it. A low rumbling from behind me. It wasn't like an animal growl, more like something from deep within the earth. I spun around, but there was nothing there. Nothing except the sound of something moving through the brush. Fast, too fast. I started backing up, trying to keep my eyes on the trees, on the shadows that seemed to be moving between them. My mind was racing, every nerve in my body screaming at me to run, but my legs felt like lead. I wanted to believe it was just some predator, maybe a weird wolf, something natural. But deep down, I knew better. This thing was hunting me. Then I saw it. At first, I thought it was a bear, but no bear I'd ever seen moved like that. It was hunched over, its body covered in matted fur, but its limbs were all wrong. Too long, too thin. Its back legs were bent like a dog's, but the front ones were more like arms, ending in claws that could tear through anything. And the smell, that sickening stench from before, was even stronger now. It was like the air itself had gone rotten. It didn't roar or snore. It didn't need to. The way it moved, the way it stalked toward me, was enough. I knew I was in deep trouble. I took off running, the adrenaline finally kicking in. I could hear it behind me, crashing through the trees like a freight train, its breath heavy and uneven, like it was enjoying the chase. I don't know how long I ran, but I ended up near the creek that bordered my property. The water was icy cold, cutting through the land like a jagged scar. I stumbled over the rocks, my heart pounding like a drum in my chest. And that's when I saw it, not the creature. A body. It wasn't an animal. It was a man, his clothes shredded, his face mangled beyond recognition. His torso had been torn open, and his insides were scattered along the creek bed, like someone had just tossed them there. I froze, staring at the corpse, trying to process what I was seeing. That's when the creature appeared again. This time it didn't charge. It just stood there, watching me. And I could see it now, clearly. It was tall, maybe 8 feet, and its fur was patchy, revealing pale, almost translucent skin underneath. It was thin, gaunt, like it hadn't eaten in days, but its muscles rippled beneath its skin. It reminded me of a hyena, the way it hunched over, but far worse, far more deliberate. I couldn't outrun it. I couldn't fight it. So I did the only thing I could think of. I dove into the creek. The freezing water stole my breath, but I didn't stop. I swam, letting the current pull me downstream. My lungs burned, my muscles axed, but I kept going, refusing to look back. When I finally crawled out of that creek, I was soaked to the bone and shivering like a leaf. I was about a mile from my cabin, downstream. I dragged myself through the mud, collapsing at the edge of the trees. I lay there for what felt like hours, expecting that thing to come after me, to finish what it had started. But it never came. Eventually, I forced myself to move. I made my way back to the cabin, grabbed my truck keys, and drove straight to the nearest town. I didn't stop, didn't look back. I just drove. I don't know what that thing was, and frankly, I don't want to know. But I'm not going back there. Not ever. Let someone else figure it out. Let the authorities deal with it. I heard later from some locals that a few hikers had gone missing in the area recently. They said it was probably a mountain lion or maybe a bear. But I knew better. There's something out there, something that doesn't belong, and it's hungry. The town I ended up in was called Thompson Falls, a small place, nothing special. I found a cheap motel, the kind where you pay by the hour and don't ask questions. I took a long, hot shower, trying to wash away the grime, the fear, the memory of what I'd seen. It didn't work. I couldn't get the image of that creature out of my head, the way it moved, the way it looked at me, and the body by the creek, the poor guy who'd been ripped apart. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was next, that it was just a matter of time before that thing found me again. I spent the next few days holed up in that motel room, jumping at every noise. I barely slept, and when I did, I had nightmares. I kept replaying the whole ordeal in my mind, wondering what I could have done differently. Should I have stayed and fought? Should I have tried to reason with it?
Yeah, right.
Like that would have worked. After a week, I knew I couldn't stay there forever. I was running out of money, and besides, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I decided to head south, to put as much distance as possible between me and that thing. I sold my truck, got enough cash for a bus ticket and a few meals. I ended up in Nevada, a small town outside of Las Vegas. It was hot, dry, and the complete opposite of Montana. It was different, but I needed different. Maybe find some work, maybe try to forget. The desert felt like a different world, and that's exactly what I needed. I found a job at a construction site, ironically enough. The work was hard, but it kept me busy, kept my mind off things, at least during the day. But at night, the fear always came back. I'd lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of the desert. Every rustle of wind, every distant coyote howl, sounded like that creature from the woods. I started having panic attacks, waking up in a cold sweat, my heart pounding. I knew I needed help, but I was too scared to talk to anyone. What would I say? Hey, I saw a monster in the woods, and now I think it's following me. They'd lock me up. One day, at the construction site, I was talking to one of the other guys, an old timer named Earl. He'd been working construction for 40 years, seen it all, or so he said. We were on break, sitting in the shade of a half-built wall, and I don't know what came over me, but I started talking. I told him about the cabin, about the prince, about the thing in the woods. I expected him to laugh, to tell me I was crazy, but he didn't. He just listened, his eyes fixed on mine. When I was finished, he took a long drag from his cigarette and said, "You saw a skinwalker, son. A skinwalker." I'd heard the term before, whispered in hushed tones by the locals back in Montana. Native American legend, a shapeshifter, a creature of pure evil. I always thought it was just a myth, a story to scare kids. They're real, Earl said, his voice low. And they're dangerous. You're lucky to be alive. He told me stories he'd heard, tales of encounters with these creatures, of people who disappeared in the desert, never to be seen again. It was like listening to a horror movie, except it was real. What do? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. You keep moving, Earl said. You don't stay in one place too long, and you never, ever go back to where you saw it. That night, I packed my bags. I didn't tell anyone where I was going, not even Earl. I just left. I took a bus to California, then another to Arizona. I kept moving, always looking over my shoulder, always expecting to see that creature again. It's been a few years now, and I'm still on the run. I don't know if I'll ever be able to stop. But I know one thing, I'll never forget what I saw in those woods. And I'll never go back to Montana. Some things are best left alone. Some things, once seen, can never be unseen. And some places, once you leave, you can never go back. Not if you want to stay alive. Not if you don't want that thing to find you. Because it's still out there. I know it is. Waiting. Hunting. And I'm just waiting for it to catch up. You know how some people talk about getting back to nature, like it's some kind of peaceful, happy, go-lucky retreat. They picture themselves living off the grid, becoming one with the wilderness. Yeah, well, they're usually the same folks who lose their minds when they can't get cell service. Me. I say it's the only way to find your damn mind. My name's Jake Collins, and I've been living in a tiny shack out in the Salmon River Mountains of Idaho since 2008. I was 32 when I decided to ditch all those modern conveniences. I like to joke that modern life is just a slow, well-decorated death trap. So, why not face the real dangers instead, right? Guess I got what I asked for. I built my place myself. Nothing fancy. Just timber and metal sheets held together by what I can only assume was sheer willpower and a healthy dose of stubbornness. I wasn't looking for comfort. I was looking for peace and quiet. A way to escape the noise that had become my constant companion back in town. Turns out, the wilderness can get pretty noisy too, but it's the kind of noise you can't tune out. Because it wants your attention, badly. One night, around late August, I was out back fixing a busted rain barrel. It was the kind of chore that keeps you grounded. Keeps your mind off the fact that the nearest person was about a 2-day hike away. No phone signal, no neighbors, no backup. Just me and whatever was out there. Then I heard something, a low sound barely registered at first, like a branch snapping, but with more weight behind it. I stood up, wiped my hands on my jeans, and looked around. The forest was thick here, but I knew every inch of it, or at least I thought I did. Now, I'm not armed, stupid, I know. Normally, I'd have my rifle leaning against the shed door. But I hadn't seen a bear or mountain lion in weeks, so I figured, why bother? Big mistake. The noise came again, louder this time. Something big was moving through the underbrush. I walked slowly to the edge of the clearing, trying to get a better look. The moon wasn't out, so visibility was crap. All I had was my flashlight, and even that felt like a candle in a hurricane. The beam caught something, a shape darting between the trees, too fast to make out. My first thought was, okay, maybe a moose. Moose are huge, clumsy as hell, but they don't usually creep around like that. Whatever this was, it was deliberate. Hunting, maybe. I shout into the darkness, thinking maybe the noise would scare it off.
Go on, get out of here! I yelled.
More for my own nerves than anything. But it didn't leave. It got closer. That's when I saw it. A shadowy mass, just beyond the tree line. It wasn't a moose. It wasn't a bear either. This thing had a hunch to its back, like it was crawling. But it was way too big for any animal I knew. It reminded me of a mountain lion, if someone had stretched it out like a piece of taffy. The way it moved was unsettling, like it didn't have bones, just muscles and skin, sliding over the ground without a sound.
Now,
I froze. My mind was scrambling for an explanation. Maybe some kind of mutated animal. The government always denied weird stuff happening out in these woods, but I wasn't buying that anymore. Suddenly, the thing lunged. Yeah, I know, lunged is a strong word, but damn it, that's what it did. It came at me fast, closing the distance in seconds. I barely had time to react. It was all instinct. I rolled to the side and grabbed a shovel I had leaning against the shed. That was all I had. A freaking shovel. The creature barreled into the rain barrel, sending it crashing into the side of the cabin with a loud bang. For a split second, I thought it might retreat. But no, it recovered faster than anything I'd ever seen and turned toward me again. This time, I got a better look. Its skin, or whatever the hell you'd call it, looked like wet leather, stretched too thin over its body. It had these long, sinewy limbs that didn't seem to belong in nature. And its face, well, it wasn't a face, not really. It was more like a snout, like a wolf or a big cat, but horribly elongated, twisted into something monstrous. I swung the shovel hard, aiming for its head. The metal connected with a sickening thud. But it didn't stop the thing. It staggered back, more surprised than hurt, I think. But I knew I couldn't risk another swing. It was too fast, too strong. I bolted for the cabin, slamming the door behind me and throwing the deadbolt. My heart was pounding in my ears. I could hear it scratching at the door, testing the wood, like it knew it could get in eventually. There was no phone, no way to call for help. I was trapped. I grabbed the closest thing I had to a weapon, an old hunting knife I kept for skinning deer. The creature's scratching grew louder, more frantic. Then, silence. I held my breath, waiting, listening. The tension in the air was so thick you could cut it with a knife. And my body was tense, too, coiled tight, ready for whatever was next. After a few minutes, which felt like hours, I dared to peek out the window. There was nothing there, just the stillness of the forest. But I knew better than to assume it was gone. That thing was patient. It was waiting. I spent the rest of the night sitting in the corner of my cabin, knife in hand, waiting for the sun to rise. I didn't sleep. I couldn't. Every little sound had me on edge, thinking it was back, thinking it would break through the walls at any moment. When dawn finally came, I ventured outside cautiously, knife still in hand. There was no sign of the creature. No blood, no tracks, nothing, like it had vanished. But I knew it hadn't, not really. I could still feel its presence out there, lurking, waiting for the right moment. That day, I made the decision to leave. Living off the grid wasn't worth becoming a meal for whatever that thing was. I packed up what I could carry, and by midday, I was hiking out of the mountains, heading back to civilization. It took 2 days to reach the nearest road, and I didn't see or hear the creature again during that time. But every moment, I felt like it was watching me, stalking me, waiting for the right time to strike. I reached a small ranger station on the edge of the forest. The ranger, an older guy named Leonard, looked at me like I was crazy when I told him what had happened. "You've been out there too long, pal," he said with a chuckle. "These woods will mess with your head." But when I described the creature in detail, his face changed. He didn't laugh anymore. He got quiet, real quiet. "I've heard stories," he muttered, almost to himself, more than to me. Then he added, a little louder, "They say it comes and goes, takes what it wants." He didn't ask me any more questions. He just nodded and told me it was probably a good idea to stay out of the mountains for a while. I didn't need convincing. I never went back to that cabin. I never even came close to those mountains again. Whatever that thing was, it was still out there. It hadn't disappeared, not like in the stories where the monster just vanishes without a trace. It was real, and it was waiting. But not for me. Not anymore. I was done with the wilderness. And as far as I was concerned, the wilderness could keep its secrets and its monsters. I was sticking to paved roads and streetlights from now on. They might be a slow death trap, but at least they didn't have teeth and claws that could slice you open like a ripe melon. Or whatever that thing would do to you if it caught you again. No thanks. I'd had enough of nature to last me a lifetime. Alright, so let me tell you about 1995. That was the year I realized that living alone, off the grid, wasn't some badge of honor like those survivalist magazines make it out to be. It could get you killed. My name's Billy Ray, and for the past 7 years, I've been calling the southern Utah desert my home, about an hour outside Escalante, if you know the area. Now, most people figure that kind of isolation messes with your head, makes you go a little cuckoo. But honestly, I always felt more at ease out there than I ever did in a crowd. I'm not antisocial, not exactly. I'm just selective, you know. Some folks just rub you the wrong way. And with a face like mine, let's just say I'm better suited for radio. I figured I'd save people the trouble of pretending to enjoy my company. Besides, I didn't need much. I built my own cabin from scavenged wood and some old corrugated steel. It wasn't pretty, but it was solid enough to keep out the wind and the rain. I trapped my own food, grew a little patch of veggies, and had a nearby creek for water. It wasn't the Ritz, but it was freedom, and that's all I cared about. One thing you learn real quick out there is that nature is indifferent. It doesn't care about you one way or the other. I've seen rattlesnakes slither across my porch like they own the place, coyotes bold enough to sniff around my shed at night. And a mountain lion once gave me a look that suggested I was on the menu. But that was just nature being nature. You expect that. What you don't expect is something that doesn't fit. Something that looks like it clawed its way out of a nightmare. It was mid-morning when I first heard it. I was working on fixing a section of my chicken coop that had taken a beating during a recent storm. The desert can be harsh like that. Then, this sound broke the usual quiet. Almost like a scream, but not human. At first, I thought it might be a cougar again. I kept a 12-gauge Remington propped up by the door for critters like that, but for some dumb reason, I hadn't felt the need to keep it on me that morning. Then, another scream came. Louder this time, from the hills to the west. It wasn't close, but it wasn't far either. You ever hear something so strange that your brain just stalls out for a second? Like it's trying to match the sound with something familiar and coming up short. That's what happened to me. I couldn't place it, but whatever it was, I knew it was big. Bigger than anything I'd want to meet without a loaded shotgun. Now, curiosity might kill the cat, but it makes idiots out of men. And I guess I was feeling like an idiot that day. I grabbed an old machete I kept in the shed and headed in the direction of the sound. I figured I'd take a quick look, see what was making all that racket, and come back. If it was a cougar or a coyote, I'd run back for the shotgun. I kept telling myself it was just some animal, but the moment I got within sight of the western ridge, I knew it wasn't. The land out here is rough. Sharp rocks, dry dirt, the kind of place even lizards give a wide berth. Up on that ridge, I spotted movement. Not much, just a quick flash of something pale. Could have been my eyes playing tricks on me, but I knew better. I climbed up as quietly as I could, and when I reached the top, I saw it. Imagine a wolf, but wrong. Too big, too lanky. Like someone took the skeleton of a bear and shoved it inside a wolf's body. It was hunched over something, tearing at it with these long, narrow jaws. The thing it was eating was dead deer, I guess, though it was hard to tell with most of its insides spread across the dirt like some gruesome art project. The creature paused for a second, its back still to me, and sniffed the air. I froze. I've never been much for prayer, but right then, I started negotiating with every deity I could think of. Then, it turned. It didn't have fur, not really. Just patches of wary hair sprouting from leathery skin the color of sun-bleached bone. The legs were too long, the joints all wrong, bending in directions they shouldn't. But its head was the worst part. Its jaws were elongated, like a crocodile's, filled with jagged teeth, and its nose was almost non-existent, just slits. It stood there for a moment, staring right past me. Then it let out another one of those horrible screams. I don't know if it saw me or just smelled me, but I wasn't sticking around to find out. I bolted, and to my credit, I made it back to the cabin in record time. The machete, gone. I must have dropped it at some point, but I wasn't planning to turn around for it. My legs burned, my heart felt like it was going to burst out of my chest, and for the first time since I'd moved out there, I genuinely regretted it. Back at the cabin, I slammed the door shut and grabbed the Remington. I sat there in the middle of the room, gun across my lap, waiting. The silence was thick, but I could feel something coming. I don't know how to explain it, just that gut feeling you get when you know you're not alone. I must have sat there for hours. The sun started to dip behind the mountains, and that's when I heard the footsteps. Slow, deliberate, right outside. Whatever it was circling the cabin, testing it. Then it stopped. Dead quiet. My finger tightened on the trigger. A heavy thud shook the door. I've heard people talk about fear, as if it's this paralyzing thing, but let me tell you, it's not. Fear is an accelerator. It makes you sharp, gives you a kind of clarity you never get when your mind's at peace. I stood up, aimed the shotgun at the door, and waited. Another thud, harder this time. The wood groaned under the weight. Then, silence again. That was somehow worse. My breath felt too loud, the sound of my own heartbeat annoying me more than anything else. I don't know why I did it, maybe because I was too scared to stay still, but I crept to the window and peeked outside. The thing was crouched near the back of the cabin, its grotesque form half hidden by the shadows. It didn't move like a predator. It moved like it was curious, like it wanted to see what would happen if it got inside. For a moment, I swear it looked right at me. Then, it turned its attention to the window. Glass shattered, and I stumbled back, firing off a shot without aiming. I wasn't thinking straight. The room filled with the stink of gunpowder, and my ears rang. The creature didn't scream this time. It just let out this low, guttural noise, a growl, almost like a chuckle. I fumbled for another shell and loaded it as fast as I could. But by the time I raised the shotgun again, it had vanished into the darkness. I don't know how long I stood there, listening. It could have been minutes, it could have been hours, but it never came back. By morning, I decided I wasn't sticking around to see if it would. I packed what little I had into my truck and got the hell out of there. I didn't bother calling the authorities. What was I going to tell them? Hey, I saw a prehistoric monster, wolf thing in the middle of nowhere, and it tried to kill me.
Yeah.
I'm sure they'd be real quick to investigate that. Before I left, though, I drove back to the ridge where I'd first seen the creature. Maybe I was looking for proof that it was real, or maybe I was hoping it wasn't. I don't know. What I found, though, was worse than either. There were more bones scattered across the ground. Some animal, some not. I found scraps of old flannel shirts, tattered sneakers, things no animal would care about, but a person might. And that's when it hit me. This thing, whatever it was, had been around a lot longer than I thought. It wasn't just hunting deer or rabbits. It had been hunting people. People who came out here thinking they could escape the world, just like me. I got back in the truck and didn't stop driving until I hit the highway. I didn't look back, not once. As for the creature, I doubt it's gone. I'm guessing it's out there somewhere, waiting for the next fool who thinks they can live off the land without consequence. And that, my friend, is a lesson I learned the hard way. You can try to run from your problems or from the world, but some things will always find you. I hope that was a satisfying conclusion to Billy Ray's terrifying ordeal. This story is all fictional, but what do you think made it so scary? My name's Ethan Reed, and for 2 years, I lived way off the grid. Way off, like in the boonies of Idaho, a place where you'd be lucky to even find a deer track, let alone a cell signal. It was 2005, and I wasn't running from the law or anything dramatic like that, just from the usual grind, you know. I'd spent over 10 years hunched over a computer, doing IT work for people who couldn't tell their mouse from their monitor. I was totally fried. So, I cashed out, sold my condo, bought a little patch of land by the St. Joe River, and built myself a cabin. No running water, no electricity, just me, the woods, and a few tools. And look, I loved it out there. More than I ever loved city life. It was quiet, well, quieter than the constant hum of servers and those awful flickering fluorescent lights. I spent most days fishing, chopping wood, and trying to get good at hunting. Not that I was some kind of mountain man, though. I'd drive into town, maybe once a month, to grab supplies and shoot the breeze with a couple of the locals. There was always plenty to chew on when you live in a place where half the folks are either doomsday preppers or think the government's putting mind-controlled drugs in the water. Thing is, those conspiracy theories always sound nuts until you find yourself smack dab in the middle of something so bizarre that nothing else makes sense. I used to chuckle at the guys in the general store, the ones who talk about weird lights in the sky, or these things they swore lived deep in the forest. I figured they were just hitting the moonshine a little too hard. One night changed all that. It was late October, getting colder every day. I'd spent most of the afternoon chopping firewood and was just about ready to call it quits. I had a kerosene lantern on the table, a pot of beans warming on the stove, and an old shortwave radio spitting out static. Nothing out of the ordinary. Just another night in the middle of nowhere. Then I heard it. At first, it was just a rustling, like the wind kicking up in the trees. But it didn't stop. It got louder, closer. This wasn't the wind. It was something else. Something moving through the bushes around my cabin. Now, I'm not one to get spooked easy, but this didn't sound like any deer or elk. It sounded heavy, like whatever it was had some serious weight to it. I grabbed my shotgun from the rack by the door.
Yeah?
I wasn't dumb enough to live out there without a gun. Bears weren't the only thing you had to worry about. Sometimes you'd get mountain lions, or worse, people who figured a remote cabin was easy pickings. I stepped out onto the porch, scanning the tree line with my flashlight. Nothing, just a bunch of shadows and that biting October wind. But then I saw it, no more than 50 yards from my cabin. Something was moving between the trees. I couldn't make it out clearly at first, just a shape, big and hunched over, with this weird, slinky way of moving. It wasn't walking, it was more like it was gliding, weaving through the underbrush like it owned the place. I raised the shotgun, pointing the barrel in its direction, but I didn't shoot. Not yet. It stopped. And that's when I got my first real good look at it. It was tall, maybe 7 or 8 feet, but it wasn't built like anything I'd ever seen. This thing was lean, covered in matted fur that clung to its skin like it was wet. Except there wasn't any water around. Its arms were hanging down low, unnaturally so, ending in these claws, long, jagged claws. But the worst part was its face. I swear, I've never seen anything like it. It wasn't like a bear or a wolf. The closest thing I could compare it to would be a hyena, but even that wasn't quite right. Its jaws were too wide, and it had these lips that curled back, showing rows of crooked, nasty-looking teeth. I didn't waste any more time staring. I fired. The blast echoed through the trees, scattering birds and sending the thing stumbling backward. It let out this sound, a sound that made my skin crawl. But it didn't stop. It just staggered for a second, and then it charged. I fired again, hitting it in the shoulder. The impact knocked it off balance, but it didn't go down. I scrambled back inside the cabin, slamming the door behind me and bolting it shut. My heart was hammering in my chest, and for the first time in years, I was scared. Not just nervous or uneasy, I was terrified. The thing hit the door hard. Wood splintered, and I heard it clawing at the walls. It was strong, way too strong. The door wasn't going to hold for long. I shoved the table against it, grabbing anything I could to barricade myself in. There wasn't much else I could do. For a solid hour, I sat there, clutching my shotgun, staring at the door, waiting for it to give. But it never did. The thing pounded and scraped for what felt like forever, and then it just stopped. No more thudding, no more clawing, just silence. I stayed up all night, waiting for it to come back. It didn't. But I wasn't an idiot. At first light, I packed up what little I had, threw it in my truck, and drove to town. I wasn't about to stick around and wait for that thing to try again. When I got to the general store, old George, one of the regulars, took one look at me and said, "You look like you've seen a ghost, son." Something like that. I muttered, not really in the mood for small talk. "You gonna tell me what happened, or do I gotta guess?" So, I told him. Everything. About the noise. The thing I saw, how it nearly broke down my door. I half expected him to laugh, but he didn't. He just nodded, like he'd heard it all before. "That's the Blackwood Creeper," George said, like it was the most normal thing in the world. "Some folks say it's a skinwalker. Others say it's just an animal, something nobody's ever really classified. But it's been around these parts for as long as anyone can remember." I stared at him, trying to process what he was saying. "And you didn't think to maybe mention this before?" George shrugged. "People don't believe in what they don't see. Figured you were one of them." I didn't know what to say to that, so I didn't. I just bought a couple more boxes of shells for the shotgun and got the hell out of there. I didn't go back to the cabin, not for weeks. I wasn't ready to face whatever the hell that thing was again. But here's the kicker, a month later. After I finally worked up the nerve to go back to the cabin, I found something. Something near the cabin that made my blood run cold. Bones. Not animal bones, human bones. They were scattered around the tree line, like something had been gnawing on them. I didn't touch them. Didn't even get close. I just turned around and drove straight to the sheriff's office. They sent a couple of deputies out to check, but when they came back, they told me there was nothing there. No bones, no sign of anything. They chalked it up to me being cover-stressed, whatever that means. But I know what I saw. There were bones, I'm not an idiot. I wasn't making it up. I didn't stick around after that. I packed up my cabin for good and moved back into town. I was done with the off-grid life. Let someone else deal with the Blackwood Creeper. It's funny, isn't it? I used to laugh at conspiracy theories. Now, not so much. After that whole mess, I ended up renting a little place above the hardware store. It wasn't much, but it had 4 solid walls, a decent roof, and most importantly, neighbors. Load. Gossipy neighbors who would definitely hear me scream if that thing ever came to town. I tried to get back to some kind of normal routine. I even picked up a part-time job at the general store, stocking shelves and helping George ring up customers. It wasn't exactly thrilling, but it kept me busy. and it gave me a front row seat to all the local gossip, which, let me tell you, was way more entertaining than anything on TV. But even with the distractions, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every time I stepped outside, I'd find myself scanning the tree line, half expecting to see that damn creeper staring back at me. And the nights were the worst. I'd lie awake in bed, listening to every creak and groan of the old building, my shotgun propped up within easy reach. I started having nightmares, too. Vivid, terrifying dreams where I was back in the cabin, and that thing was outside, scratching at the door, its weird, hyena-like face pressed up against the window. I'd wake up in a cold sweat, my heart pounding, convinced it was real. One evening, a few weeks after I'd moved to town, I was closing up the store with George. We were sweeping the floors and counting out the register when he suddenly stopped and looked at me, a strange expression on his face. "You ever think about why it came after you, Ethan?" he asked, his voice low. I shrugged, trying to act casual. "Wrong place, wrong time, I guess." George shook his head. "Maybe. Or maybe it was drawn to you. Some folks say these things, they can sense fear. They can smell it." I scoffed. "You're starting to sound like one of those conspiracy nuts, George." He just chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. "Maybe I am. Or maybe I've just lived here long enough to know that there are some things in this world that can't be explained. Things that are better left alone." His words sent a chill down my spine, and I couldn't help but wonder if he was right. Maybe there was more to the Blackwood Creeper than just being some weird, undiscovered animal. Maybe it was something darker, something more sinister. I didn't have much time to dwell on it though, because that's when we heard it low, guttural growl coming from outside. It sounded like it was right outside the back door. George and I froze, our eyes locked on each other. We both knew that sound. We'd both heard it before. "It's here," George whispered, his eyes wide with fear. My blood turned to ice. I could feel the adrenaline coursing through my veins. I grabbed the shotgun I kept behind the counter, my hand shaking. "Stay here," I told George, trying to sound braver than I felt. "I'll go check it out." He didn't argue. He just nodded, his face pale. I crept towards the back door, my senses on high alert. The growling was getting louder now, closer. I could hear it scratching at the door, just like it had done at the cabin. I took a deep breath, then threw open the door, my shotgun raised. And there it was, the Blackwood Creeper. It was standing right outside the door, its eyes glowing in the dim light. It was even bigger and more terrifying than I remembered. I fired. It's funny how fast things can go from dead quiet to pure chaos. Out here, silence is like a lifestyle. You get used to it, even start to find comfort in it, you know? Me? I've been living off-grid for almost 5 years now. Tucked away in a little cabin I built myself in the Ouachita Mountains of Arkansas. Never really had a choice, to be honest. City life wasn't gonna cut it for me, not after what I've been through. My name's Caleb Hayes. Folks in town just call me that mountain man, and I've learned to live with that too. The year was 2006, and by then, I knew this land like the back of my hand. My cabin sat in a clearing near the edge of a seriously thick forest. The kind of place where you could go days without seeing another soul. I liked it that way. Besides, who needs people when you've got deer, rabbits, and the occasional black bear to keep you company. Now, I'm not a gun nut, never was. It's not like I'm against them or anything. I just never saw the need. This land was peaceful enough, and I trusted my traps way more than I trusted a bullet. Plus, there was always this joke I'd tell myself: if anything tries to get me, I'll just outsmart it. Looking back, man, was I naive. That day started like any other. I was fixing up a section of my chicken coop that got messed up in a storm the week before. Nothing major, just some patching up. The sun was getting low, but there was still plenty of light left to finish the job. As I was hammering in the last nail, I noticed something off. Something in the woods, just beyond the tree line. At first, I thought it was just a shadow, you know, the kind of thing your mind does when you've been alone too long. But then, I saw it move. My first thought was, deer. We get plenty of those around here. But this thing, it wasn't moving right. Deer are jumpy, quick on their feet. This thing was stalking, slow and deliberate. I don't know how else to put it. I tried to shake it off. Probably just my imagination playing tricks again, I told myself. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. By the time I finished up with the coop, the thing hadn't moved any closer, so I went inside and tried to forget about it. I made some coffee, sat by the window, and just watched the forest. No movement. Everything was still. About an hour later, I heard it. This low, rumbling sound. Almost like the ground itself was growling. It was faint, but it made the hair on the back of my neck stand straight up. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside, figuring I could check the perimeter before it got completely dark. I wish to God I hadn't. At first, everything seemed normal. The trees were swaying gently in the breeze, and the chickens were clucking softly in their coop. But then that rumbling came again, this time louder, closer. It was coming from the woods. My first instinct was to yell out, but I quickly realized how dumb that was. I wasn't dealing with something that was gonna answer back. Then, I saw it. Right at the edge of the clearing, standing half in shadow, was something I can only describe as just wrong. It was tall, easily over 6 feet, but it moved in this hunched over, crouching way, like it was uncomfortable being upright. Its arms were long, way longer than they should have been, and its head, well, it reminded me of a wolf, or maybe a coyote, but not quite right. It was too angular, too messed up, like someone had stretched out an animal's features and made them almost human, in the worst possible way. I backed up slowly, my mind going a mile a minute. Should I run? But where? The cabin wasn't exactly Fort Knox, and that thing was too close for me to make a run for my truck. I was trapped, and the worst part was it knew it. As I stood there, frozen stiff, it started to move toward me. Each step was slow and deliberate, like it was sizing me up. I could see its chest rising and falling with each breath, the muscles in its body rippling under a coat of patchy fur. I didn't wait for it to get any closer. I bolted, ran straight back into the cabin, slammed the door, and locked it. I don't know what I expected to happen next. Maybe it would get bored and wander off. Maybe it would go back into the woods. But instead, I heard something that made my blood run cold. The sound of claws scratching on the wood of the cabin. That thing was right outside, and it wanted in. Now, like I said before, I'm not a gun guy. But in that moment, I wished I had something, anything, to defend myself. The only thing I had was an old axe by the fireplace, so I grabbed it and braced myself for the worst. The scratching turned into banging, the wood creaking and groaning under the pressure. I don't know how long I stood there, clutching that axe like it was my lifeline, because, well, it was. Just when I thought the door was about to give, the banging stopped. Silence, pure terrifying silence. I waited. 5 minutes, 10 minutes, nothing. Slowly, I went to the door, my heart pounding like a drum. With one hand on the knob and the other gripping the axe, I opened it just a crack. Nothing. The clearing was empty. Relief washed over me for like a split second. Then I heard something behind me, a faint shuffling sound. I spun around, and that's when I saw it. The creature had somehow gotten inside. It was standing in the corner of the room, all hunched over, its head cocked in that unnatural way, staring at me like it was deciding how it wanted to make its move. I can't explain what happened next. Something in me just snapped. Maybe it was the adrenaline, or maybe it was just pure survival instinct. But I charged at it with the axe, swinging like a madman. I hit it once, twice, 3 times, each hit landing with a sickening thud. The thing let out this horrible, gut-wrenching scream. No, not a scream, more like a howl. But I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. By the time I was done, it was lying in a heap on the floor, not moving. Blood pooled around its body, staining the wooden floorboards. I dropped the axe, my hands shaking, my breath coming in ragged gasps. It was over. Or so I thought. As I stood there, staring down at the creature, I noticed something weird. The body, it wasn't disappearing. It wasn't fading away like something out of a freaking horror movie. It was just there. Real. Solid. Proof that what I had seen, what I had killed, wasn't just some figment of my imagination. I didn't know what to do. Should I call someone? But who the hell would believe me? Some mountain man, living alone in the woods, claiming he killed a creature that shouldn't even exist.
Yeah.
No one. That's who. But I knew I couldn't just leave it there. So, I did what any sane person would do. I buried it. Deep in the woods. Far away from the cabin, where no one would ever find it. It took me most of the night. I dragged that thing, heavy as all get out. Through the trees, my flashlight beam dancing around like a nervous firefly. Every snap of a twig, every rustle in the undergrowth, had me jumping out of my skin. I kept expecting to see another one of those things, or maybe even the same one, somehow alive again, coming to get revenge. Finally, I found a spot, a small hollow hidden beneath a thick tangle of roots and vines. I dug until my arms ached and my hands were raw. The ground was hard, rocky, and I was pretty sure I hit every tree root in Arkansas. But I kept going, fueled by adrenaline and a healthy dose of fear. When the hole was deep enough, I rolled the creature's body into it. It landed with a dull thud, and for a second, I just stared down at it, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. It looked even more wrong in the dim light of my flashlight, its fur matted with blood, its limbs twisted at unnatural angles. I quickly filled in the grave, piling the dirt and rocks back on top, then covered it with leaves and branches, trying to make it look as undisturbed as possible. When I was done, there was no sign that anything had ever been buried there. As for the aftermath, well, let's just say I never told a soul. The folks in town still see me as that mountain man, and that's fine by me. Life went back to normal, or as normal as it can be when you've killed something that shouldn't exist. I still live in the cabin, still go about my day like nothing happened. I cleaned up the blood, scrubbed the floorboards until they were spotless. There is no sign, nothing left to indicate that night ever happened, at least not on the surface. But every now and then, when the wind blows just right, I catch a whiff of something full like decay, and I wonder if it's still out there. Or maybe it was never just one. The whole experience changed me though. I'm a lot more cautious now. I keep the axe close by, even though I still don't own a gun. I find myself looking over my shoulder more often, especially when I'm out in the woods. And I never, ever stay out after dark. Not anymore. Some nights, I have nightmares. I see that thing, its twisted face, its glowing eyes. I hear it scratching at the door, its unholy howl. And I wake up in a cold sweat, my heart pounding, the silence of the cabin suddenly feeling more oppressive than comforting. But most days, I just keep on living. I tend to my chickens, I work on the cabin, I try to forget what happened. But I know I never really will. It's always there, lurking in the back of my mind, a dark secret that I'll carry with me to my grave. It's a reminder that there are things out there, in the shadows, that we don't understand, things that defy explanation. And sometimes, the most terrifying monsters are the ones that walk among us, hidden in plain sight, or in this case, hidden deep in the woods, waiting for the perfect moment to remind us they exist. I just pray to God I never have to see another one. One was definitely enough for a lifetime. Alright, so, let me tell you about the time I nearly lost it in the woods. It was back in '94, and I made the dumbest mistake of thinking that being alone would fix all my problems. My name's Alex Ramsey, and I'd spent most of my life surrounded by people, too many people, if I'm being honest. I was always moving, job to job, city to city, and the constant noise, the rush, the freaking chaos, it got to me. I figured getting off the grid, going full hermit, would give me the peace and quiet I was craving. So, I packed my bags, sold everything I didn't absolutely need, and shacked up in this tiny cabin, deep in the Kaibab National Forest in Arizona. Now, I was never a gun guy. Not that I was against them, exactly, but it always felt like owning a gun just invited trouble, the kind I definitely didn't want. And besides, what was the worst that could happen in the middle of nowhere? Coyotes. Please, those weren't even worth worrying about. The cabin was small, but it was enough for me. Wooden walls, a porch that creaked like an old man's knees, and a roof that leaked a little when it rained. There wasn't another soul for miles, just me, the pine trees, and the occasional deer passing by. It felt perfect, at least for the first few weeks. One afternoon, I decided to take a walk down this old logging road near my place. The air was crisp, with that earthy smell of pine needles, and I felt like I had the whole forest to myself. I even remember joking to myself that I was like one of those survivalist dudes you see on TV, living the dream. What a joke that turned out to be. About a mile in, I found something weird, a carcass. It was an elk, or what was left of it. Now, I'd seen dead animals before, but this was different. It was torn open in a way that just didn't make sense. It wasn't like a predator had taken it down for food. There were pieces of it scattered around, but nothing had been eaten. It was like something had just destroyed it for fun. I stood there for a while, trying to wrap my head around it, but the longer I looked, the more uneasy I felt. I shrugged it off, telling myself it was probably just a bear, even though that didn't quite fit. Still, I wasn't looking for trouble, so I headed back to the cabin. As I walked, I couldn't shake this feeling that I was being watched. You know that feeling, right? Like you can just tell. I didn't turn around, though. I didn't want to know if something was behind me. It was probably just paranoia, I told myself. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the cabin made my skin crawl. Around midnight, I heard something outside. Not footsteps, exactly. It was more like something dragging itself through the dirt. I told myself it was just the wind, or maybe a branch falling, but the sound didn't stop. It circled the cabin, slow and deliberate, like whatever it was knew I was inside. I grabbed the closest thing I had to a weapon, a dull hunting knife I used to whittle sticks, and waited. The sound went on for hours, stopping every now and then, only to start up again. I barely slept a wink. In the morning, I went outside, half expecting to see claw marks or something that would explain the noise. But there was nothing. No tracks, no broken branches, nothing. It was like whatever had been out there had just vanished into thin air. Still, I wasn't about to let my imagination run wild. I had left the noise and the madness of the city for this, for solitude and quiet. No way was I going to let one weird night ruin it. For the next few days, everything was normal. I convinced myself that the elk carcass and the noise were unrelated. Maybe some scavenger had gotten to the elk after something else had killed it, and the noise was probably just some animal curious about my cabin. Nothing to lose sleep over, right? But then, a few days later, I found something else. This time, it wasn't an animal, it was a person. Or, at least, what was left of one. A hiker, maybe. His body was torn apart, just like the elk. Arms and legs twisted in ways they shouldn't be, the torso split open, with organs spread out like some kind of sick display. I nearly threw up when I saw it. His face was still intact, though, frozen in this look of pure terror. I ran back to the cabin and tried to call for help on the old radio I kept for emergencies. Nothing, no signal. I was on my own. I locked the doors, barricaded the windows, and just sat there, my mind racing. What kind of animal does something like that? And why hadn't I heard anything? Night came on fast, and with it, the noise returned. This time it was louder. The dragging sound from before was back, but now there was something else. A scratching, like nails or claws raking against the cabin walls. I held my knife close, knowing it was about as useful as a toothpick against whatever was out there. Suddenly, the scratching stopped. The silence was worse. I sat there, every muscle in my body tense, waiting for whatever was coming next. Then, without warning, the door buckled, like something had slammed into it. I heard the wood crack, the hinges straining as whatever it was hit the door again. Harder this time. I was full on panicking now. There was no way out except the windows, but I knew better than to go outside in the dark. Not with that thing out there. The door crashed open, splinters flying across the room, and there it stood. It wasn't like anything I'd ever seen. Massive, hunched over, with a body covered in matted fur. Its limbs were way too long, arms dangling past its knees, and its fingers, if you could even call them that, ended in these sharp, jagged claws. It moved like it didn't belong in this world, lurching forward in this unnatural, jerky way. But the worst part was its face. It had this snout, like a wolf's, but twisted, stretched into something grotesque. I did what any rational person would do in that moment. I ran. I bolted through the back door and into the woods, the sound of heavy footsteps pounding behind me. It was fast, too fast. I could hear it breathing, this ragged, wet sound that made my stomach churn. I tripped over a root, crashing to the dirt, but before I could even think about getting up, it was on me. Claws ripped across my back, and I screamed, thrashing, trying to get away. Then, just as quickly as it started, it stopped. The thing froze, sniffing the air, like it had caught a whiff of something more interesting. Without looking back, I scrambled to my feet and ran like hell, not stopping until I reached the road, several miles away. I don't know how long I ran. When I finally stopped, it was dawn, and I was standing in the middle of some dirt road, covered in blood, with no clue where I was. Eventually, a truck driver found me. I must have looked like a complete lunatic, babbling about monsters and dead hikers, but he believed me enough to take me to the sheriff's station. The sheriff wasn't exactly the type to believe in tall tales, but when I showed him where I found the hiker's body, he went pale. I didn't stick around for any investigation. Whatever was out there, I wasn't going to wait for it to come after me again. I left that cabin the next day, moved back to town, and I haven't been back to Kaibab since. Whatever it was, it's still out there. I'm sure of it. Something that just doesn't belong in this world, something that kills for sport. The sheriff told me later that they found more bodies. Hikers who'd gone missing over the past few months, all torn apart in the same way, with no explanation for what did it. They stopped looking after a while, said it was bears, or maybe a mountain lion. But we both knew better. And I guess that's all there is to it. My big plan for peace and quiet turned into the worst nightmare of my life. I still have nightmares about that thing, about its face, about the way it moved. I learned my lesson, though. Some things are way worse than the hustle and bustle of the city. Some things you just don't want to meet alone in the woods. And some doors, once they're opened, you can never really close them again. My name is Ben Carter. I was 36 when I decided to camp at White Butte in North Dakota, a trip that would straight up change my life in ways I couldn't have even imagined. Back then, I was still reeling from a messy divorce, desperate for some peace and quiet, a place to just think. I'd always heard that White Butte was this remote, lonely peak, perfect for someone who needed to be alone. So, I packed up my beat-up old camping gear and set out with my German Shepherd, Duke. Duke was my best bud, a big, loyal goofball who'd been on countless road trips with me. But he was getting older, and I worried the cold nights might be too much for him. Still, I couldn't leave him behind. He was the only company I trusted. The drive to White Butte took me over dusty roads that stretched across empty fields and rolling badlands. By the time I reached the trailhead, it was late afternoon, and the sun was already dipping toward the horizon. This place felt like the edge of the world. The sky was so huge. It felt like you could fall right off if you walked too far. I was pulling my ratty old tent and single sleeping bag from the trunk when I noticed this woman approaching. She was wearing these well-worn hiking boots and had a small pack slung over her shoulder. Her dark hair was pulled back in a tight bun, and she walked with this confident stride, you know. She called out, smiling brightly, "I'm Ashley Monroe. I'm studying geology for a project at my university. Are you heading up White Butte?" I hesitated. I really didn't want company. "Yeah," I said, keeping it short, hoping she'd get the hint. But she just beamed like I'd invited her to a party. "Greet. Mind if I join you for a while?" she asked. "I promise I won't slow you down." I glanced at Duke, who was sniffing the air in her direction. He wasn't growling, but he wasn't wagging his tail either. Something about Ashley's eagerness rubbed me the wrong way. But, I didn't have a real reason to say no. "Sure," I replied with a shrug. "I'm Ben Carter, by the way, and this big guy is Duke." For the first few hours, everything seemed normal enough. Ashley chatted about rock formations and how White Butte was formed. I admitted I didn't know much about geology, though I did enjoy reading about local legends. She seemed really into that, asking what stories I'd heard. When I mentioned the tale of a murdered settler woman who supposedly haunted these parts, Ashley just giggled like it was some silly campfire story. We made camp just before sunset. I realized, with a growing sense of dread, that my gear was barely good enough for the dropping temperatures. My tent was ancient, with these little tiers I hadn't bothered to patch. The sleeping bag was thin, meant for warmer weather. The forecast had said it would be mild, but out here, the wind could whip across the open plains, chilling you to the bone. After dinner, some sad, dehydrated meals eaten around a small fire, I crawled into my tent, Duke right beside me. I could hear Ashley humming cheerfully in her own tent nearby. For some reason, that tune put me on edge, like she was way too comfortable in a place that felt distinctly unwelcoming. That night, I woke up to Duke's low, throaty growl. He was standing at the tent flap, hackles raised. My heart started pounding. "What is it, boy?" I whispered. Then I heard it, a faint humming, eerily similar to the tune Ashley had been humming earlier. But it was distant and echoing, like it was riding the wind from somewhere far away. It made the hair on my arms stand on end. I unzipped the tent slowly, shining my flashlight into the darkness. The beam cut through the night, revealing nothing but the swaying tall grass. But Duke kept growling. He never growled unless something or someone was out there. In the morning, I told Ashley about the weird humming, expecting her to either confirm it or brush it off as nothing. She just gave me this cryptic smile and said she'd slept like a rock. Then, she changed the subject completely. It hit me then that I didn't actually know anything about her school or her research. A prickling sense of doubt started to worm its way into my mind. That afternoon, while we were exploring the base of the butte, I noticed Ashley slip away. She came back a couple of hours later, covered in dirt and sweat, her eyes lit up with this intensity that made my stomach twist. "What were you doing?" I asked, trying to keep my voice casual. "Exploring, like I said. The rock formations here are fascinating," she answered smoothly, but she seemed irritated by my question. "You should mind your own business, Ben." I let it go, but the uneasy feeling just kept growing. Duke seemed wary around Ashley too, never taking his eyes off her. That night, the humming came back, louder this time, more insistent. Duke whined and scratched at the tent floor, like he wanted to get out, but I stayed inside, too freaked out to face whatever was out there. On the third morning, I woke up to find my camping gear scattered all over the place. The plastic plates, water bottles, even Duke's food bowl were strewn in a wide circle around the tent. In the center was this crude symbol etched into the dirt, almost like a spiral that ended in a jagged slash. My pulse went into overdrive at the sight. It definitely wasn't something a curious animal would do. I confronted Ashley, but she just shrugged. "Maybe some local kids wandered by," she said. "Here," I countered. "There's nobody for miles." Ashley just smiled again, but there was no warmth in it this time. It was kind of creepy, to be honest. We had another tense conversation around lunchtime. I was getting ready to head toward a small cave I'd spotted the day before. Maybe I could take some pictures or do a little exploring myself. But Ashley insisted on tagging along. Something in her eyes, a sharpness, put me on high alert. We ended up hiking into a more secluded area near the base of White Butte, thick with jagged rocks and scraggly brush. The wind had picked up, sending dust swirling into our faces. I was about to tell Ashley we should head back to avoid a storm, when she suddenly stopped and pulled a handgun from her pack. "Drop your stuff," she demanded. Her face had totally changed. All that fake friendliness was gone. "What?" I froze, Duke at my heel. She aimed the gun at me. "You hurt me. I'm not a geology student. My friends and I, we wait for unsuspecting travelers. Usually, I work with a partner, but he's busy taking care of something else. All you need to know is I want your valuables, your truck keys, anything worth money." I raised my hands. "I don't have much, seriously. My wallet's in the tent, and my gear is worthless." "Don't lie to me," she snapped. Duke lunged, barking like crazy. Before he could reach her, she fired a warning shot into the air. The crack echoed through the emptiness. Duke stopped, teeth bared. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it was going to burst out of my chest. "Back," she ordered me, then reached into her pocket, pulled out those plastic zip ties, and tossed them at my feet. "To your feet, then your hands. Hurry up." With trembling fingers, I did what she said. She came closer to tighten the ties. Before I could react, she slammed the butt of her gun against my temple. Pain exploded in my head, and I collapsed, my vision swimming. I could hear Duke barking furiously, but then I heard another shot, and then silence. When I came to, I was tied to a tree trunk, my head throbbing so fiercely I thought I might throw up. Duke was nowhere in sight. I strained against the zip ties, panic flaring. Ashley was gone, and she'd left me to bake in the merciless midday sun. I don't know how long I was out there, but it felt like hours. Eventually, I managed to slip one hand free when the plastic tie snapped against a jagged piece of bark. My wrists were bloody and raw, but I was free. All my gear, including my phone, was gone. My tent and truck keys were presumably back at camp, but I couldn't be sure. The only thing on my mind was finding Duke. I stumbled through the scrub, the sun pounding down. My head ached, and I felt dizzy. Hours later, I spotted Duke limping toward me, a bloody wound on his flank. He whined softly as he approached. "Good boy," I whispered, dropping to my knees to check him out. It looked like a grazing bullet wound, painful, but not immediately life-threatening. Anger surged through me. I needed to get Duke to safety. As the sun dipped low, I realized I was lost. The landscape seemed foreign in every direction, and the shadows stretched out like long, ominous fingers across the barren land. Then, once more, I heard that humming. Only this time it sounded closer, more distinct, like a woman's voice drifting on the breeze. Duke whimpered at my side, cowering. I followed the sound, more out of a lack of options than any real plan. Eventually, I came upon a narrow opening in the side of the butte, just big enough for a person to squeeze through. Duke stayed close. Inside, the cave was musty and cold. My flashlight flickered across the walls, revealing etchings in the rock symbols that looked vaguely like the spiral I'd seen near my campsite. Farther in, I found what looked like a makeshift shrine of bones, dried flowers, melted candles, and a stained journal. Fear turned my stomach as I lifted the book. The yellowed pages contained frantic handwriting about a woman who'd been murdered by her husband on White Butte. The entries became more and more erratic, describing sightings of a ghostly figure in a white dress who could mimic voices and drive people mad with her wailing. That's when I heard footsteps behind me. I whirled around to see Ashley, pale and trembling. She didn't look anything like the confident thief who'd held me at gunpoint. Her eyes were wide with terror, It's out there, she whispered, pointing toward the entrance. That humming. It's not me. It's not a person. I backed away, unsure whether to believe her. You left me tied to a tree. You shot my dog. Her lip trembled. I heard that thing. I got lost. I came here to hide. A sudden, ear-splitting wail cut through the silence. I doubled over, covering my ears. Duke howled, and Ashley screamed, sinking to her knees. The noise felt like shards of broken glass slicing through my skull. And then, as abruptly as it began, the wail stopped. In the flickering light, I saw her, a woman in a torn white dress, floating at the edge of the cave's darkness. Her hair hung in ragged strands, her face half hidden. But her eyes, those eyes were empty, dark holes that stared with hateful intent. She raised her hand, beckoning us deeper into the cave. Ashley fired a shot, but the woman in white disappeared, leaving only a faint echo of her haunting song. The bullet ricocheted off the rock, throwing sparks. I seized the moment, tackling Ashley and wrenching the gun from her grip. She struggled, but I was fueled by rage and terror. Once I had the gun, I pressed it to her back. You move, I shoot, I hissed. Before I could decide what to do next, the ghost reappeared, screaming again, driving us both to our knees. When I looked up, the woman in white was hovering mere inches from Ashley. She opened her mouth in a silent snarl. Ashley's eyes rolled back, and she collapsed, blood trickling from her ears. I wanted to run, but some instinct told me the ghost wouldn't just let me leave. I remembered the journal in my hand, flipping frantically through its pages. One passage mentioned burning the settler's final writings to end her hold on this place. With trembling hands, I gathered the candles and the other items strewn around. I lit one candle and set the journal's pages on fire. The flames curled the edges of the paper, releasing a foul smoke that stung my nostrils. The woman in white shrieked, a sound so piercing that I thought my eardrums would burst. Duke cowered against the cave wall, whimpering. The ghost advanced on me, her hollow eyes locked on the burning pages. My vision blurred from the noise, my heart pounding. I forced myself to keep the journal in the flame. The shrieking intensified, then suddenly, the ghost faded, her form dissolving like mist. A final, echoing moan reverberated through the cavern, and then silence. Ashley lay unmoving on the cave floor. I checked her pulse. She was barely alive, her breathing shallow. Even after everything she'd done, I couldn't just leave her there. Gathering my courage, I dragged her out of the cave. Duke limped alongside us, every step seemingly more painful than the last. My only goal was to find my way back to the main trail, to get help, any help. We didn't make it far before stumbling upon a group of local hunters. Relief washed over me, only to vanish the moment I saw the hostility in their eyes and the rifles slung across their shoulders. "Don't move," one of them barked. There were 3 of them, rough-looking, and they appeared more frightened than anything else. "You on white butt for a reason." I tried to explain what had happened, that Ashley had robbed me, that there was something supernatural in the cave. The more I spoke, the more their expressions hardened. One of them aimed a rifle at me while the other searched my pockets. "She's the one who's been messing around here?" one hunter asked, pointing at Ashley's limp form. "He killed her, you think?" My heart lurched. "No, she's not dead. She needs a doctor." "What about the rest?" another growled. "We found signs of someone snooping near our property last week. Could be him." They bound my wrists with a rope, ignoring my pleas for reason. Duke snarled. But the men threatened to shoot him if he came any closer. They dragged me and Ashley to a crude hunting shack in a depression between some rocky outcroppings. Inside, it smelled of stale beer and sweat. They chained me to a post, leaving Ashley unconscious on the floor, her wrists loosely tied. One of the hunters spat at my feet. "Stay put till we figure out what to do with you," he said, slamming the door. I sat there for what felt like an eternity, the weight of the day's horrors crushing me. My head still pounded from Ashley's earlier attack. Duke stayed by my side, whining softly. His flank was bleeding again. I promised him we'd get out of this, but even I didn't believe my own words. At some point in the night, I heard the men arguing outside about how to handle us. One wanted to turn us over to the police. Another insisted, no cops. Something about stolen property. Fear gnawed at me. If they decided to kill us and hide our bodies out here, who'd ever know? Desperation surged. I scanned the shack for anything to help me escape. My gaze fell on the wood, burning stove across the room. Faint orange embers glowing in its belly. If I could reach those embers, I might burn through the rope binding my wrists. I waited until the hunters' voices faded, presumably heading off to drink or sleep. Then, I inched closer to the stove, tugging Duke along gently. The rope was long enough that I managed to brace it against the metal edge of the stove, hoping the heat would weaken the fibers. My skin stung as the rope heated, and a sharp burn lanced my wrist, but I bit down on my lip to keep from crying out. Finally, the rope snapped. I was free. My wrists were raw and blistered, but I tried not to think about the pain. I quickly untied Ashley. She was awake but weak, her face drawn. Without her gun, she seemed just as helpless as me. Whatever hatred I felt for her, I couldn't leave her behind to face these hunters alone. Assuming she'd even live that long after the encounter with the woman in white. We moved quietly, creeping out of the shack. One of the hunters was on guard nearby, dozing against a tree. I spotted a lantern and a small can of gas at the edge of the camp. An idea sparked in my mind. If I created a distraction, maybe we could slip away. I poured a little gas around the lantern, then struck a match and backed off. The flames erupted, startling the guard awake. He cursed, kicking at the fire, which only spread. In the confusion, I motioned for Ashley and Duke to follow me. We slipped into the night, my heart thundering. We hiked for miles, fear propelling us forward. Duke limped, but he refused to quit. At dawn, we finally stumbled upon a dirt road. My truck was in the distance, apparently abandoned by Ashley, where I had originally set up camp. How she got it there, I had no idea. But the sense of relief was almost overwhelming. The truck, battered and with a broken window, was still drivable. My wallet and phone were gone, but the keys were in the ignition, as if she planned to return for it later. Ashley stood back, pale and trembling. She looked like a completely different person from the woman who had first greeted me with that charming smile. Her gunshot wound to Duke, her betrayal, all of it still churned inside me like bile. She opened her mouth to speak, but I cut her off. "Just go," I said. "I'm taking Duke to a vet. If you cross my path again, I won't hesitate to defend myself." Ashley didn't argue. She turned and walked down the road without another word, leaving me to watch her retreating figure until she disappeared around a bend. Maybe she was heading toward wherever her mysterious partner was, or maybe she was just escaping into the wild. I felt no sympathy for her. My concern lay solely with Duke. I got my wounded dog into the passenger seat. He was shaking, but he rested his head in my lap as I started the engine. I drove as fast as I dared on the unpaved road, hoping to reach a town before Duke's condition worsened. My side mirror revealed a plume of smoke rising from some distant area. Perhaps the hunters' camp was engulfed in flames, or perhaps they managed to contain it. Either way, I was beyond caring. I reached the nearest town by mid-afternoon, half delirious from exhaustion and fear. A local vet patched Duke up, though the bullet graze and subsequent infection left him crippled in his hind leg. The vet quietly asked if I wanted to call the police, but I only nodded, not even sure how to explain the chain of events. By the time the authorities arrived, I was nearly catatonic with fatigue. I told them as much as I could: the betrayal, the kidnapping, the ghost I'd seen. They regarded me with a mix of concern and skepticism. Despite the ghostly element of my story, the police at least took the kidnapping and assault seriously. They promised to check out the area and question any hunters they found. But I knew deep in my bones that they wouldn't find the woman in white. Some things can't be pinned down by patrol cars and paperwork. After giving my statement, I took Duke to a quiet motel, nursing him through the worst of his injuries. His leg would never fully heal, but he was alive, and so was I. Sometimes, late at night, I swear I can still hear that humming. It's a faint sound in the back of my mind, a reminder of how close I came to death in those desolate badlands. As for Ashley, I never saw her again. But I wouldn't be surprised if she's still out there somewhere, searching for her next victim. Or maybe she finally fell prey to the ghosts of White Butte. And the ghost herself, the woman in white. I believe I ended her hold on the cave by burning that journal. But there's a nagging doubt at the edges of my thoughts. Because the land around White Butte feels ancient, haunted by more than just one restless spirit. When I close my eyes sometimes, I see her hollow eyes glaring at me through the darkness, as if to say, I'm not finished yet. I left North Dakota a week later, driving with Duke's head resting on my lap. We were both scarred, physically and mentally, but we were alive. The wind howled across the plains, and just as I passed the sign that read, "You are leaving North Dakota," I thought I heard a faint voice singing on the wind, a lonely, discordant tune that followed me all the way home. I was a park ranger stationed in a fire tower. It had a strange set of rules. When I first got the job, I couldn't believe my luck. I was a very solitary person. I loved to read and be alone. When I saw an ad for a park ranger manning a fire tower, I just about jumped out of my skin. Working overnight at a Walmart wasn't exactly the best job in the world. There are some stories I could tell about that as well. But I applied for the job and was ecstatic that I got it. They made me do a week of training before my first shift. Most of it was dry reading and making sure I was qualified in CPR. They showed me the job's ins and outs, and then I followed in my car as we drove to the tower. In the middle of the day, it was all inspiring to stare up at the underside of the tower, looming above me, suspended high in the air by the metal pylons. Once I started climbing the narrow metal stairs with hints of rust at the edges, I was somewhat less than excited. In fact, I was terrified. I don't like heights very much. It's not like I go all vertigo or anything. It's just I prefer to stay on the ground. Once we reached the top and pushed open the trap door to get onto the deck that surrounded the tower, I was doing a little better. I opened the door that led into the tower's interior. Looking around the room made me forget all about the terrible climb. It was like a small apartment. There was a small refrigerator, sink, counter, cupboards, and a small table. In the center of the room was a table with a map permanently attached to it. Of course, there were windows all around. There was a 360-degree view, as you would expect for a fire tower in the middle of a state park. The view was absolutely amazing. I could see the peaks and valleys for miles in every direction. It was a photographer's dream. The other ranger explained what was expected of me. We worked 24-hour shifts, so there would be times I would have to sleep. But I had to set an alarm and get up to scan for problems at least once per hour during the night. During daytime hours, I had to scan every 30 minutes. There was a radio to report any trouble and a phone in case I needed to call the fire department. In my mind, I was already drooling at the thought of getting paid to take amazing pictures and sit around reading books. The ranger told me that it was extremely important that I read the rule book first thing. He asked if I had any questions, and I said no. He reinforced that I could not leave the tower no matter what until I was relieved. I followed him down the narrow staircase to get my supplies from my car. He got in his truck and hesitated for a moment, as if he wanted to say something else. But then he shut the door, wished me well, and drove away. It took me 3 trips to get all my stuff up to the top. At home, it's nothing to bring a few boxes of groceries into the house. Here, it became life and death. I was near the top with the box in front of me, when I stumbled on one of the narrow steps and nearly fell over the side. I paused for a long moment to regain my balance before continuing to the top. It suddenly struck me that this job might not be the cakewalk I thought it was. I pushed that thought to the back of my mind and went for my next 2 loads. Basic supplies, books, phone chargers, camera, occupied the second and last trips. Once I was up for good, I collapsed into the chair. I was on my way to Napland when I heard static on the radio. I jumped up and grabbed it. "Hello," I said, but no one answered. I figured this was the ranger's subtle way of reminding me it was time to do a check. But lugging 3 loads up the tiny stairs of death had put a serious crimp in my fire watch time. In fact, it had been nearly an hour since the other ranger had left. I did my slow pan around the room, checking each part of the forest for smoke and seeing none. Having successfully completed my first go-around, I celebrated with a bottle of water while I put the groceries away. The cupboards weren't empty, but they weren't a gourmet's delight either. Nearly a full shelf of baked beans didn't exactly thrill me, but I had the supplies that should do me for a few shifts. I sat the bread on the counter and loaded the cold cuts in the fridge. I would get some more options the next time I went shopping. By the time I finished putting things away, it was time for another check. The sun was starting to set, so I grabbed my camera and took some amazing pictures. I couldn't wait to upload them to my computer at home. As I looked around the room, my eyes landed on the manual. I realized I hadn't read it yet. I sighed and took it over to the chair. I was sure it would have me out cold in no time. As I opened the book, a piece of notebook paper fell out. I picked it up and read. The real rules: 1. Never, under any circumstances, leave the fire tower until you are relieved. 2. Turn off all lights between the hours of 2 and 3 am. If you receive a radio transmission or phone call between those hours, do not answer. 4. If anyone knocks on the trapdoor during those hours, tell them they'll have to wait until morning. Do not open the door. 5. If you see a glowing object floating toward the tower, don't look at it. Cover your eyes and count to 50. When you open your eyes, it should be gone. If not, cover and count to 50 again. 6. If animals surround the tower, don't go down to look. Fire your flare gun into the air twice, 1 minute apart. Then lock yourself in the bathroom and hope for the best. I sat the note down and stared at it. Was this a joke? Were they having some fun with the new guy? I wasn't looking forward to getting hazed at 2 o'clock in the morning. I put the note back in the book and skimmed through the manual. It was a real snooze fest of standard rules and nonsense. For the next check, I decided to use binoculars. I was rewarded by seeing a bear and 3 deer. I pulled out my camera and took some pics, but the zoom wasn't quite as much as I needed to get some really good shots. You could still tell it was a bear, but it was a little blurry. I decided to go camera shopping with my first paycheck. What's the use of having this spectacular view if I can't take good pictures of it? Soon after sunset came the twilight. The sky lit up a brilliant orange. I took some more pictures and did my scan. I was just about to go back inside when I noticed a thin wisp of smoke in the distance. I grabbed my binoculars and tried to get a better view, but there were too many trees in the way. I pulled out my compass and got a general direction, then grabbed the radio and called the ranger on duty. I told him I had a fire and gave him the direction and general distance. He acknowledged and said he would check it out. I stayed glued to my binoculars, waiting to see the smoke lessen. Minutes seemed to each take an eternity as the smoke continued to rise. Nearly a half hour later, the radio came to life. "Hey, rookie," the ranger said. "Did you find it? Did you put it out? I still see smoke. Did I tell you the wrong place?" I said into the radio all in one breath. "War there?" he said. "Everything's fine. It was just a campfire." "A what?" "A campfire," he said. "Nothing to worry about. A campfire," I repeated in a daze. "Yeah, you'll want to see more smoke, and it should be a lot thicker and darker before you call it in." I stood in silence. My face beat red with embarrassment. "Cheer up," the ranger said into the silence. "At least you didn't call the fire department." I looked over at the phone, knowing I was mere minutes from doing that very thing. "Yeah, thanks," I said. "Sorry about that." "Don't worry, kid," he said. "At least you erred on the side of caution instead of letting the forest burn down." I put my face in my palm and shook my head. So much for a good first impression. Twilight had faded, leaving a few last vestiges of light as the clouds transformed from dirty gray to black. I began to realize just how alone I was out here when the canopy of the night fully fell. Doing my checks from inside was nearly impossible. I had lights on, and every window I looked out of became a mirror of me looking back in and at myself. Alone in a wooden box suspended 100 feet above the ground made it that much creepier. I stepped out onto the deck in the cool evening air. The total darkness was oppressive. I couldn't see anything. How was I supposed to see smoke? I did a slow walk around the deck, looking out blindly at the trees. As my eyes adjusted, I was able to make out some shapes of the mountains, and even the soft glow in the distance of the nearest town. That was small comfort to know that things still existed out in the world, and I hadn't been plunged into this cover of darkness. I finished my check and stepped back inside. After being out in the darkness, it was way too bright. I turned off the main overhead light and the light over the entrance. The room settled into a comfortable glow with enough light to see but not blind. In fact, it was a little too cozy. I felt a nap coming on. I laid down on the surprisingly comfortable cot and closed my eyes. I woke sometime later to static sounding on the radio. I reached for the radio to answer it, but something in the back of my mind told me not to. I looked at my watch and it said 2:12 am. I froze. Looking around the lit room, I thought about the strange rules I had read earlier. I reached up and turned off the light, plunging the room into darkness. As my eyes adjusted and I could see a few things, I looked out the window and could swear I saw someone peering in at me. Just then I heard static on the radio. There was a voice trying to get through, but it seemed too weak. I waited to see if they would call again. A minute later, static sounded again. Beneath it, I heard the voice. It was a little stronger this time. I could just make it out. "Help me," it said in a feeble yet insistent voice. I reached for the radio, but something made me glance at my watch first. It was 2:23 am. I faltered and didn't answer. Those creepy rules, I thought. What if they're real? I've already broken one by having the lights on. What happens when you break the rules? I sat in silence, wanting to know the answer, but at the same time not wanting to know. The radio call came through much more clearly this time. "Help me. Can't anyone hear me? I need help." The voice sounded desperate. I couldn't tell if it was a man or a woman. It had a strange quality that I couldn't quite place. I fought the urge to answer, not knowing if I would be fired for dereliction of duty or not. This what I was out here for. I needed to answer, but my mind just wouldn't let go of those rules. The minutes ticked by like hours. 3 more times the radio sounded out its plea, each time sounding more desperate. I watched the time, counting the seconds until 3. When the time finally came, I picked up the radio. "Whoever was calling for help, please state your position so I can relay help to you," I said. "Who is this?" came the answer on the radio. "This is a park ranger manning a fire tower." "Well, park ranger, I've been on this channel all night, and yours is the first voice I've heard." That's not possible, I thought. I had several calls for help over the last hour, I said.
"Are you sure?" "Absolutely."
I wrote down the time of each called. "Then why didn't you answer them until now?" I paused. What could I say? Because a weird list of rules told me not to. "Ranger, I said hesitantly. Extenuating circumstances." "Extenuating circumstances," the voice repeated as though tasting them. "And what circumstances would those be?" Whoever this was, they weren't going to let it go. I'm not at liberty to say. "You mean like falling asleep and breaking the rules?" the voice said, sounding deeper, raspier, and more menacing. I froze. I hadn't turned the lights on yet, leaving the room in eerie darkness that left me feeling very exposed. I slowly panned around, looking out the windows, and remembering the earlier feeling of being watched. "You can look all you want, but you won't see me," the voice said. "It's after 3, I said, hoping the terror I felt wasn't evident in my voice. "You have no power over me." The voice chuckled. It wasn't a pleasant sound. "Normally you would be correct. However, you broke the rules." "What if I didn't know about the rules?" I said, grasping at straws. "Nice try. But you knew that you should be safe after 3. Damn it," I thought. Eat picked up on that. "So what do you want?" I said, fearing the answer. "We're hungry," the voice said. Only now it sounded like many voices speaking at once. "Calm down and let us feed." My legs turned to rubber as I stumbled over to the door and stepped out onto the deck. The moon was rising half full, casting light into the darkness. I looked down and saw over a dozen large animals surrounding the tower in a circle, and each one of them was looking up at me. I dove back inside and locked the door. I frantically searched for the flashlight. Once I found it, I picked up the phone to call the ranger station. There was no dial tone. I hung up and tried again, but still nothing. I pulled out my cell phone, but there was no signal. I paused to clear my head. Oak, I thought, you're freaked out right now, but what's actually happened? A weirdo on the radio, some animals around the tower. This list is making you paranoid. Just then I looked outside, and there was light off in the distance that looked like an airplane. The problem was it was heading straight toward me. It was mesmerizing. I found myself staring into the rapidly approaching glow until I realized it was going to ram into the tower. I found the best cover I could on the opposite side of the room and surrounded myself with as much furniture as possible. Being that the furnishings were sparse, that meant I dragged the chair over in front of me. I covered my eyes and hoped for the best. I may or may not have mumbled one of those promise I'll be good if you get me out of this prayers. The seconds tumbled into minutes. Nothing happened. I peeked over the edge of the counter and the light was gone. I breathed a sigh of relief and wondered why I hadn't heard any engine sound. I decided it was because I was too busy ducking for cover. Then it hit me. I grabbed the manual and pulled out the list of rules. There it was, rule number 5. If you see a glowing object floating toward the tower, don't look at it. Cover your eyes and count to 50. When you open your eyes, it should be gone. If not, cover and count to 50 again. I read over the rules again and realized how many had come to pass. For a long moment, I thought that maybe it was an elaborate joke. Some of the rangers yanking the rookie's chain. But there was too much I couldn't explain. The radio transmissions, the glowing light, the animals surrounding the tower. Then I realized I had broken that rule too. I hadn't fired the flare gun as instructed. I dug through the cupboard where the emergency supplies were kept and found the gun. I grabbed 2 flares and stepped out onto the deck. As I questioned the intelligence of firing flares that could end up causing a forest fire when I was supposed to be trying to prevent them, I heard a strange sound. I held my breath and cocked my ear for a better listen. It wasn't just one sound, it was many. I glanced over the side of the rail toward the ground and saw the animals all growling and pawing at the ground, working themselves in a frenzy. I backed away and loaded the first flare, then pointed up and fired. It rose majestically, glowing blood red until gravity slowed its ascent and pulled it back to Earth. I watched closely to make sure not only that it went out, but where it landed, just in case. I waited a minute and fired the second flare, watching where it landed as well. I stepped back inside and hid in the bathroom as instructed. I knew in my heart that I was safe from the animals as long as I didn't go down the steps. The radio sounded off, scaring me nearly half to death. Fire tower number 5, the voice said. "Have seen your flares. I'm on my way. Are you physically injured?" "No, not at the moment," I said. "I'll explain when you get here." "Roger that. En route." I tried to calm my nerves by thinking about what job I would apply for next, and how unfortunate it was that this one didn't work out. I thought about what I was going to tell the ranger when he got here. I couldn't tell him the truth. But what else could I say? There were some animals at the bottom of the tower that scared me. I honestly considered calling him back and telling him not to come when I felt heavy footsteps, the bottom stairs of the fire tower. I must have been daydreaming and let time slip by. I stepped out of the bathroom and went to the trapdoor. "Are you here already?" I said into the radio as I reached down to unlatch the trapdoor. That was fast. "What are you talking about?" came the clear answer over the radio. "I'm not there yet." I paused as I felt the footsteps come closer to the top. "Where are you?" I said quietly. "I can barely see the tower. I'm probably a mile away." His words hit me like a sledgehammer. I looked down at the bolt I was about to unlatch and pulled my hand back very slowly. "Which direction are you coming from?" I said. "Southeast." I looked in that direction and sure enough, I could see headlights approaching. The radio sounded again, but with a slightly different voice. "Tower, ignore that last transmission," it said. "I'm already here. Let me in, please." I stared down at the trapdoor as though it wanted to bite me. "Tower, let me in," it said more insistently. I backed away as something began beating on the trapdoor with tremendous force. The boards shook with every impact. I stepped inside and locked the door, then barricaded it with my only loose piece of furniture, the chair. "Tower 5, Tower 5. I don't know who that is talking to you, but it isn't me. Do not open that door. Repeat. Do not open that door." I backed into the bathroom with the flare gun in hand and locked the door. The pounding on the trapdoor became louder. I knew it wouldn't take much more of a beating. The whole room shook with every impact. I closed my eyes and prayed in earnest this time. And then my salvation came in the form of the engine sound of a pickup truck. I knew the real Ranger was here. I listened as it came closer and then stopped. There was an awful silence for a moment and then gunfire. Over and over, multiple shots in rapid succession. Then there was a lull followed by more shots. The pounding on the trapdoor had stopped as soon as the truck pulled up. "The coast is clear, Ranger. You can open the door now," came a voice over the radio. I put my hand on the knob, smiling to go out and greet my savior, when I heard a weak transmission. "Don't, not me," it rasped. A heartbeat later, the screaming began. It was a gut-wrenching scream of terrible suffering. I could hear it beneath me. All I could do was drop to the floor and curl up in a ball as the screaming went on and on. I closed my eyes and tried not to imagine that poor Ranger being ripped to shreds by God knows what. Soon the screams lessened in volume and intensity as though they were moving away. I rocked back and forth, hugging my knees until unconsciousness mercifully took me. I woke to strange voices calling my name. I opened my eyes and I was surrounded by people in blue uniforms. I panicked and backed away from them as fast as I could until my back hit a wall. "Calm down," one of them said. "It's all right." I looked around the room like an animal that had been backed into a corner. I was ready to fight my way out. "Are you injured?" he said. My mind raced to remember where I was. I looked out the window and it was morning. The sun was shining and I could see blue clouds. Everything from last night came back to me in a rush. I looked around the room and saw nothing out of the ordinary. "I'm not injured," I said to the EMT. "Can you tell us what happened here?" a ranger said from behind them. I looked over at the manual that contained the list of rules, and for a heartbeat considered telling him to read them.
"No,"
was all I said instead. Can I go home now? The ranger glared at me, wanting answers, and not getting them is frustrating, I know. Is he alright to drive? The ranger asked the EMT. They gave me the once-over BP lungs, heart rate, and didn't find anything to be concerned about. I'd say physically, he's fine, the EMT said. The ranger sighed. Go ahead, he said. But I'll want to talk to you tomorrow. I nodded and stood, gathered my things, and started toward the door. When I got to the open trapdoor, I hesitated, seeing it had been hacked open with an axe. I took a tentative first step, then another. Surviving a night as I had only to fall down several flights of stairs would be quite ironic. As I made my way down, white knuckling the railing the whole way down, I saw people busy at the bottom. They were picking up shell casings with gloves and putting them into plastic bags. I could see spots of blood here and there, but no bodies, either human or animal. I saw the trail of blood as it disappeared into the woods. I stood on the bottom step for a long time, wondering if I was allowed to step onto the ground. I took the step and bolted for my car. I started it up and drove out of there as fast as I could. Just as I turned onto the gravel road, a deer walked out in front of me. I slammed on the brakes and slid to a stop mere inches from hitting it. It didn't move, just stood there staring at me. As I looked more closely, I could see blood on its nose and mouth. My heart skipped a beat when I saw a shred of a ranger's patch impaled on one of its antlers. Its eyes bored into mine as I slammed into reverse, then swerved around the deer, and broke every speed limit getting home. I called my boss and quit as soon as I got there. Then I packed and started looking for a job in the city. Maybe I can find a nice quiet warehouse to guard. But if it has a set of strange rules, I'm walking out, no questions asked.